Louis XIV, the Sun King, ruled France for an astonishing 72 years, making him one of the longest reigning monarchs in European history. But let's be honest, ruling a country isn't the only thing Louis excelled at. He had an eye for detail, a flair for the dramatic, and as history would have it, a remarkable curiosity about people's breath. Yes, the Sun King didn't just aim to control the politics of France, he aimed to control the very air circulating in his presence. He didn't just rule France, he ruled noses, as one might say, if they were trying to survive a dinner at Versailles without being subjected to the royal sniff test. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, Louis XIV's weird obsession with smelling people's breath, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Born in 1638 to Louis XIII and Anne of Austria, Louis XIV came into the world during a time of immense political intrigue and shifting power. He became king at the tender age of 4 following his father's death, but it wasn't until he declared his personal rule at the age of 23 that his peculiar personality truly began to take center stage. If history had a catalogue for monarchs with an obsession for minutiae, Louis XIV would occupy not just a shelf but the entire wing. His court life revolved around the meticulous management of appearances, ceremonies, and social hierarchies. Every action, every gesture, every bow, and yes, every exhalation could be scrutinized under his royal gaze. Louis's obsession with etiquette extended far beyond the ordinary concerns of any ruler. While most monarchs might worry about armies, alliances, and taxes, Louis worried about who coughed too loudly, who fidgeted during court gatherings, and especially who brought unpleasant odors into his immediate vicinity. Hygiene in the 17th century was flexible, to put it politely. Bathing was infrequent, teeth were seldom brushed, and personal scents were largely ignored outside elite circles. Louis, however, had a nose for precision, literally. He became famous, at least within the gilded walls of Versailles, for inspecting not just the appearance, but the very breath of those around him. It's said he could detect garlic, onions, or other pungent offenders from across a room. One imagines courtiers walking on eggshells or perhaps chewing parsley incessantly just to survive a royal encounter. This fascination wasn't limited to sniffing for unpleasant odors. Louis XIV's obsession with cleanliness and presentation extended to clothing, hair, and even the way courtiers carried themselves. Every day at Versailles was an elaborate performance. The king himself was a walking spectacle. He maintained meticulously styled wigs, ornate clothing, and a posture that suggested he was simultaneously conducting an orchestra and judging everyone else's life choices. The phrase Sun King wasn't just metaphorical. It captured his desire to shine, dominate, and radiate absolute control. And when one controls the light, it makes sense that one would also control the air one breathes, or at least be extremely picky about it. Louis XIV's quirks weren't limited to personal hygiene and sniffing. He had an almost scientific approach to order and ritual. Morning routines, evening routines, ceremonial appearances, everything had a script, and those who misstepped risked embarrassment, exile from the king's favor, or worse, subtle social humiliation. Yet, amid this rigor, there was humor in his obsessions, even if it was entirely at the courtier's expense. Imagine having to curtsy, smile, and simultaneously ensure your breath did not offend the ruler of France. Breakfasts of onions or garlic became dangerous experiments. A single misstep could make your morning feel like a royal trial. And here's the kicker. Despite all the pomp, wealth, and absolute power, Louis' obsession with breath reveals something surprisingly human about him. He wasn't just a figurehead. He was a man who derived a sense of control and perhaps amusement from the minutiae of life around him. It's a reminder that history's grand figures were still people with quirky, sometimes baffling habits. He might have commanded armies and dictated international treaties, but he also paused to judge the scent of a courtier's mouth with the same intensity as he judged a diplomatic alliance. It's a strange, oddly relatable blend of the monumental and the mundane, the powerful and the peculiar. So, as we step into the gilded, heavily scented halls of Versailles, remember, Louis XIV wasn't just the Sun King of France. He was a man of habits, rituals, and yes, a man with a nose that demanded perfection. In the coming chapters, we'll explore how this peculiar obsession shaped life at court, influenced fashion and hygiene, and turned everyday breath into a matter of political importance. Because in the world of Louis XIV, nothing, absolutely nothing, was too small, too strange, or too aromatic to escape the Sun King's attention. And if you think surviving politics is hard, try surviving his nose. Imagine a palace so grand that it makes modern-day mansions look like dollhouses. That's Versailles under Louis XIV. A sprawling, gilded labyrinth where marble gleamed under crystal chandeliers, gardens stretched like meticulously painted carpets, and every corridor echoed with the whispers of hundreds of courtiers vying for attention. But Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a stage, a theatre where the king himself was both the main actor and the audience. And in this theatre, your every action and yes, even your breath was part of the performance. Life at Versailles was as much about spectacle as it was about survival. Courtiers had to master the intricate dances of etiquette, from when to bow to when to kneel, to which hand to use when handing over a fan. Misstep in this choreography, and you risked ridicule, social exile, or the subtle but devastating loss of royal favour. Now, sprinkle in Louis XIV's obsession with breath, and you get a world where even inhaling wrong could be dangerous. At Versailles, the royal Wi-Fi didn't spy on your emails, it sniffed your mouth. Proximity to the king was everything. The palace was structured so that those closest to the king physically also enjoyed the most influence. But closeness came at a cost. The closer you were, the more exposed your personal habits became to his scrutiny. One misaligned wig, one improper curtsy, or one particularly pungent breath could make you the target of whispered gossip. Courtiers quickly learned that survival at Versailles required both social acumen and olfactory hygiene. A single garlic-laden breakfast could follow you like a neon sign saying, "I am unfit for royal presence." The architecture of Versailles itself enforced this surveillance. Long, narrow galleries, reflective mirrors, and vast echoing halls allowed the king and his ever-watchful aides to monitor movements, gestures, and appearances at all times. Mirrors weren't just for vanity. They were instruments of control, ensuring that no one could sneak past without the king, or at least his sense of smell, taking notice. In this environment, the air itself became a political tool. Courtiers learned to carry discreet sachets of herbs or small bottles of perfume, not as accessories but as breath armor. Forget your fan, your mouth now required strategic planning. And speaking of strategic planning, social hierarchies dictated who could even approach the king. Certain apartments were reserved for high-ranking nobles, and entry was tightly controlled. Yet even the elite weren't immune. Being too confident or too casual could bring you face to face with Louis XIV's scrutinizing nose. Imagine practicing your best conversation, polishing your smile, only to have your morning onion breakfast betray you as soon as you entered the king's chamber. It was a world where the scent of diplomacy could literally make or break your position. Meals at Versailles were themselves performances. Every dish, every course, every sip of wine was judged not just for taste, but for how it would affect your olfactory presentation in the king's presence. Courtiers who dined too boldly risked lingering aromas that could mark them as socially unrefined or worse, biologically suspect. In such a tightly controlled environment, air was currency, and the aroma of your mouth could cost you more than money. It could cost you status, influence, and sometimes even favor in courtly intrigues. Of course, Versailles wasn't all fear and tension. The palace's extravagance and theatricality lent itself to humor, absurdity, and irony. Courtiers would whisper about who had survived the king's sniffing rituals and who had not. Jokes circulated about breath scandals and secret herbal stashes, and while everyone tried to maintain composure, the underlying truth was clear. Even the most powerful nobles had to negotiate their existence with their mouths as carefully as with their words. Beyond etiquette and performance, the very geography of Versailles shaped the king's breath obsession. The palace was designed to impress visitors from outside France, and to consolidate power by keeping the nobility under constant observation. Gardens, fountains, galleries, and apartments all acted as both decoration and surveillance mechanisms. Courtiers moved as if on a chessboard, aware that every gesture, every step, and every exhale was monitored. A poorly timed sigh, a sudden cough, or a whiff of something unpleasant could draw attention faster than a misplaced bow. Versailles, then, was not merely a home or a palace. It was a microcosm of control, display, and social theatre, where Louis XIV's obsessions dictated the rhythm of life. It was a place where the king's personality permeated every stone, every mirror, every gust of scented air. And while the courtiers developed elaborate routines, perfumes, and tricks to survive, it was all in service of maintaining proximity to the Sun King without becoming a casualty of his acute sense of judgment or smell. In the end, living at Versailles meant mastering the art of presence, posture, and freshness. Every corridor echoed with whispers, every chamber smelled of oils, perfumes, and occasionally desperation. For the courtiers, existence was a balancing act. Be charming, be poised, and most importantly, be breathable. Because in the palace of Louis XIV, nothing escaped scrutiny, not your dress, not your smile, and certainly not your breath. In the 17th century, personal hygiene was flexible. Bathing was rare, dental care was rudimentary, and clean teeth were often a sign of wealth, not health. Yet Louis XIV's obsession with breath shows that even in an era of questionable hygiene practices, the king was acutely aware of the social and moral implications of a foul exhale. Back then, bad breath wasn't just rude, it was practically a crime against the crown. Understanding why Louis XIV cared so much requires a detour into the peculiar world of historical hygiene. Unlike today, where brushing, flossing, and mouthwash are mundane daily tasks, dental care in Louis's France was inconsistent at best. Teeth were cleaned with cloth, frayed sticks, or abrasive powders made of chalk, salt, and herbs. Some courtiers chewed mint, cloves, or parsley, hoping to mask the inevitable stench of a sugar-heavy diet combined with irregular brushing. But no matter how clever the masking, bad breath persisted as an unavoidable and socially perilous fact of life. Bad breath was often more than an olfactory annoyance. It was a marker of disease, poor breeding, or moral decay. Medical theories of the time were a cocktail of observation and imagination. Miasma theory, the idea that foul smells caused illness, was widely accepted. A person with a stinky mouth might be suspected of harboring invisible toxins, carrying sickness not only in their body but potentially threatening those around them. Louis XIV, ever the meticulous ruler, would have considered such odors a potential danger, even if the science behind it was shaky. To the king, a courtier's breath could reveal the hidden rot of the body, the negligence of upbringing, or the fragility of social status. The connection between breath and morality may sound absurd today, but it was a serious matter at court. Clean, fresh breath signaled discipline, refinement, and virtue. A stinky mouth, by contrast, suggested laziness, carelessness, or a lack of respect, qualities utterly unacceptable in someone who hoped to navigate the treacherous waters of Versailles. Courtiers weren't just judged on their etiquette or fashion. The invisible currents of morality and discipline flowed through every aspect of their presence, including the tiny molecules escaping their mouths. A careless sigh could betray more than impatience. It could betray a lack of decorum, which, in Versailles, was as dangerous as any political misstep. Dental health also played a role in the king's obsession. Tooth decay, gum disease, and infections were common in the 17th century, and these conditions naturally caused foul breath. In a world without modern dentistry, cavities could fester and gums could rot, creating odors that spread like invisible courtly scandals. For Louis XIV, who demanded perfection in every aspect of courtly life, allowing such natural imperfections to exist in his immediate vicinity was unthinkable. The Sun King's attention to breath was a form of control over biology itself, a way to ensure that even the natural failures of the human body conformed to the high standards of Versailles. Diet further complicated matters. Rich, sweet pastries, heavily spiced foods, and exotic imports were all staples at the French court. While indulgent and a sign of wealth, these culinary delights were a perfect recipe for pungent, lingering odors. Garlic, onions, and aged cheeses were particularly treacherous, capable of undoing hours of careful odor-masking efforts. Courtiers had to balance their desire for gastronomic delight with the risk of being punished by the king's acute olfactory senses. To dine recklessly was to flirt with social disaster. A single whiff of offending breath could transform a moment of pleasure into an embarrassment of epic proportions. The Sun King's fascination with breath also reveals the intersection of science, superstition, and social order in 17th century France. Medical knowledge was growing, but it was often intertwined with symbolic meaning. Disease, morality, and social status were all encoded in the body, and particularly in the mouth. Louis XIV, as a meticulous observer of both people and power, used breath as a barometer for these qualities. In other words, sniffing a courtier's mouth was not just a quirk. It was a diagnostic tool, a moral audit, and a subtle display of authority all at once. Of course, there was humor hidden in this obsession, though it was entirely at the expense of the courtiers. Imagine trying to maintain your dignity while fearing that a single exhale might betray your hidden garlic indulgence or lazy morning routine. Courtiers reportedly carried small sachets of aromatic herbs, mints, and clove-studded pomanders, essentially pocket-sized gas masks for social survival. It was a world where odor was a weapon, a threat, and a status symbol all at once, and where the king's nose could strike without warning. Ultimately, Louis XIV's fixation on breath was a reflection of his broader obsession with control. He demanded perfection in art, politics, fashion, and manners, and breath was no exception. By linking hygiene, morality, and disease through something as simple as exhaled air, the Sun King extended his authority into the most intimate and invisible corners of his courtiers' lives. A foul mouth wasn't merely unpleasant, it was a failure to uphold the high standards of Versailles itself, and a reminder that in Louis's court, nothing escaped scrutiny, not even the tiny molecules floating from your tongue. So the next time you complain about someone sitting too close on the subway, imagine walking the gilded halls of Versailles under the watchful eyes and nose of Louis XIV. Every exhale mattered, every bite of garlic could have consequences. And in this world, bad breath wasn't just rude, it was practically a crime against the crown. At Versailles, etiquette wasn't just a set of guidelines, it was a sport, a spectacle, and occasionally a survival challenge. Among the many bizarre rituals that defined the court of Louis XIV, one of the most peculiar was the king's direct and very personal scrutiny of his courtiers' breath. Yes, the Sun King literally sniffed people's mouths, using his nose as both a tool of judgment and an instrument of authority. Imagine standing in line for a royal breathalyzer. Only the officer is the king himself, and the consequences of failure were social exile or humiliation, not a fine. This ritual was not random. Louis XIV had an acute sense of smell, and he used it to gauge the propriety, hygiene, and to some extent the reliability of those in his immediate circle. Courtiers quickly learned that a day in the Sun King's presence could involve an unexpected olfactory examination. It was said that some noblemen and women would nervously chew herbs, clove-studded candies, or even chew a discreet piece of parsley before entering the king's chamber, as if the act could magically render them invisible to the nose of France. The line between strategy and superstition was razor-thin. Who got sniffed? The practice primarily targeted those in close proximity to the king, attendants, advisors, and high-ranking nobles whose actions and words carried immediate weight. Lower-ranking servants and distant courtiers rarely experienced the full force of this unusual ritual, though they still had to maintain general cleanliness. The logic was simple. The more influence you had, the more closely your character, both moral and physical, was scrutinized. Your mouth, it seems, was a reflection of your reliability and decorum, and Louis XIV wasn't content to leave it to imagination. But proximity didn't guarantee inspection either. The king's sniffing was as selective as it was intimidating. Those who had proven themselves loyal, charming, or particularly adept at masking their aromatic faults might avoid this scrutiny. Conversely, courtiers who had previously offended the king, failed in etiquette, or displayed visible nervousness were prime candidates. The ritual became a subtle instrument of social sorting, allowing the Sun King to reinforce hierarchy, reward compliance, and subtly humiliate those whose performance or hygiene faltered. In essence, it was a very 17th century form of auditory and olfactory vetting rolled into one. The ritual itself had structure. During formal assemblies or private audiences, courtiers were expected to present themselves with the utmost dignity. They would bow, kneel, or curtsy according to the strict rules of Versailles, all while maintaining the facade of poise and composure. Then came the moment of truth, a subtle lean forward, a gentle sniff, sometimes audibly acknowledged, sometimes just an internal evaluation. Louis XIV's nose didn't merely detect food aromas, it could discern nervous sweat, lingering tobacco, and even the faintest traces of medicinal herbs meant to mask olfactory imperfections. One misstep, one unfortunate whiff, and the courtier could be marked for quiet reprimand, gentle mockery, or pointed gossip in the hallways. Interestingly, the ritual had its own unofficial hierarchy of danger. Certain courtiers were virtually guaranteed inspection, those seated closest to the king during dining, those tasked with ceremonial duties, or those whose proximity to power was under scrutiny. Meanwhile, peripheral figures, musicians, attendants of lesser status and visiting dignitaries might escape the intense scrutiny entirely, though they still had to tread lightly. To be sniffed was both an honor and a hazard. An honor because it meant you were close enough to influence, a hazard because failure could leave an invisible mark on your reputation. The social implications were profound. Courtiers began to plan their entire day around odor management. Morning routines became rituals of strategy, brushing with powdered chalk, chewing aromatic herbs, and avoiding foods that might betray their presence in the king's chamber. Some accounts suggest that courtiers would even adjust their diets for weeks in advance to prepare for important appearances, fearing that one rogue onion or clove of garlic could compromise their standing. It was a form of olfactory politics, where the aroma of your mouth could sway influence, secure favor, or ruin your social trajectory. Humor, as always, found its way into this strange practice. Courtiers whispered about being sent to the nose, or joked about clandestine parsley consumption. The king's sniffing became a kind of inside joke, shared quietly among those who survived the ordeal. Still, there was a fine line between amusement and anxiety. Failing the sniff test could turn humor into humiliation in the blink of an eye. It was a reminder that power at Versailles extended into the most intimate, unexpected, and sometimes absurd corners of life. Louis XIV's ritual, as odd as it seems today, illustrates the extreme lengths to which absolute power could permeate daily existence. The king didn't just demand obedience in politics or ceremony. He demanded control over personal space, behavior, and even the very molecules leaving your mouth. It was a subtle but potent form of social engineering, enforcing hierarchy, loyalty, and decorum in the most unexpected ways. In the end, the royal sniffing ritual was as much about asserting authority as it was about curiosity. Courtiers learned to approach each day with care, knowing that their every exhale could be monitored. It was a world where etiquette, hygiene, and survival intersected in the strangest of ways. And for the Sun King it was a simple rule: if you were close enough to influence him, you were close enough for him to judge your breath and your character without mercy. Imagine standing in line for a royal breathalyzer, only the officer is the king himself, and the stakes are nothing less than your social life at Versailles. At Versailles, survival wasn't just about etiquette, it was about aromatic strategy. By the mid-17th century, Louis XIV's acute obsession with breath had transformed French court fashion into a delicate, fragrant battlefield. Perfumes, scented gloves, face powders, and subtle sprays were no longer mere luxuries. They had become mandatory breath insurance. Courtiers didn't just wear elaborate clothing to impress the king. They wrapped themselves in clouds of scent, hoping to pass undetected through the Sun King's meticulous olfactory scrutiny. Perfume wasn't just fragrance, it was armor against the king's nose, as one might mutter under their powdered breath while edging toward a royal audience. The evolution of perfume at court was rapid. France had been a center for fragrance for decades, but Louis XIV elevated the practice to an art form directly linked to survival. Entire rooms in Versailles were dedicated to the preparation, storage, and careful application of scents. Rose, violet, and amber became not only markers of wealth and refinement, but tactical tools in the art of courtly self-preservation. Courtiers applied them liberally to collars, cuffs, and even under the arms, but the most critical areas were near the mouth. After all, the king's nose was always on patrol. One could argue that a small vial of perfume was the 17th century equivalent of a tiny personal bodyguard, invisible yet indispensable. Scented gloves became another subtle defensive measure. At first glance they seemed purely ornamental, velvet, silk, embroidered with gold threads, but their practical purpose was equally crucial. Hands carried odors from meals, herbs, and even the lingering smell of animals or servants' chambers. Gloving oneself in scented leather allowed courtiers to shake hands, gesture, or bow without inadvertently wafting offensive odors toward the king. In effect, gloves became both fashion statement and olfactory shield, a way to negotiate power without risking a whiff of trouble. Face powders and cosmetics also played an important role. Beyond the obvious aesthetic appeal of rosy cheeks or a powdered nose, these substances helped mask the natural odors of the skin, which in the warm, crowded halls of Versailles could be challenging. Women and men alike carried delicate powder puffs, dabbing discreetly throughout the day to maintain a barrier between their natural scent and the king's discerning nose. Powdered wigs, meanwhile, served a dual purpose. They demonstrated wealth and social status, but the scented powders also masked the less than pleasant realities of long hair that wasn't washed regularly. In other words, the higher your wig, the safer your reputation, at least in terms of smell. Louis XIV's obsession with breath and scent directly influenced broader fashion trends. Clothes were tailored not only for appearance, but also for olfactory strategy. Collars were designed to funnel fragrance upward, cuffs to hold aromatic herbs, and ruffles to create tiny pockets of perfumed air. Even the fabrics themselves were sometimes treated with scent, ensuring that a courtier could survive an hour in the king's presence without triggering a sniff test failure. Designers and perfumers thrived under this new demand. Fragrance became as essential as silk, lace, or gold embroidery. In a court where appearances were everything, the aroma you carried was as important as the cut of your coat. Interestingly, this scented armor had social signaling effects beyond survival. Those who arrived at court dripping with the latest fragrance demonstrated not only hygiene awareness, but also wealth, sophistication, and loyalty. Conversely, the courtier, who underestimated the Sun King's sense of smell, risked subtle yet damaging humiliation. Perfume thus became a language of power, a way to assert one's place in the social hierarchy without saying a word. Every spritz, dab, or puff conveyed meaning, wealth, attention to detail, and allegiance to the king's peculiar standards. Of course, overuse of fragrance came with risks of its own. Too much perfume could overwhelm, creating clouds of scent that made it impossible to discern anything, including the subtle aromatic cues Louis XIV valued. Courtiers had to master the delicate art of balance, enough to protect themselves from scrutiny, but not so much that the perfume became a weapon of olfactory offense itself. This balancing act created its own form of daily tension and drama, the invisible duel of scent versus scent, where failure could lead to whispers, ridicule, or even temporary ostracism. And let's not forget the humorous side of all this preparation. Courtiers reportedly joked about carrying portable scent kits like miniature arsenals, exchanging tips about which herbs worked best, and plotting pre-sniff rituals to avoid detection. One can almost imagine a group of nobles crouched behind a curtain, carefully sprinkling rosewater while whispering, "If he smells even a hint of garlic, you're doomed." Life at Versailles, with its dazzling architecture and glittering ceremonies, was punctuated by these absurdly meticulous and sometimes comical preparations. In the end, Louis XIV's obsession with breath and scent transformed Versailles into a court where aroma and appearance were inseparable, and survival depended as much on fragrance strategy as on political skill. Perfume wasn't merely a luxury, gloves weren't just fashion, and powder wasn't just decoration. They were essential tools in a delicate dance of olfactory diplomacy. In a world where the king could judge you with nothing more than a sniff, scent became power, and power became survival. So the next time you dab a little cologne or perfume, imagine doing so with the pressure of the Sun King's nose looming over you. At Versailles, your fragrance wasn't just a statement of taste, it was armor, weaponry, and insurance all rolled into one elegant puff of scented air. Brushing your teeth in 17th century France was, let's call it, aspirational. For most people, the concept of toothpaste as we know it today didn't exist. Instead, courtiers relied on a combination of chalk powders, crushed herbs, and sometimes even ashes to clean their teeth. And while this sounds like a medieval horror show for modern dental hygienists, it was considered perfectly respectable at Versailles, provided of course you followed it with a generous dose of aromatic herbs to mask the inevitable stench. Brushing your teeth? Luxury. Passing the king's sniff test? Near impossible. To understand the stakes, we need to explore the dental and hygiene myths of the time. Garlic and onions were culinary staples, beloved for flavor, digestion, and so they thought health benefits. But the downside, they made your breath an instant battlefield. Some courtiers tried to mitigate this with clove or mint, while others went as far as gargling with vinegar or wine. Yes, wine. The belief was that alcohol could neutralize bad humors in the mouth, which were thought to cause not just odor but disease and moral corruption. Courtiers often went to extreme lengths to protect their oral reputation, because one whiff of garlic at the wrong time could undo weeks of courtly politeness. The toothpaste substitutes of the day were equally questionable. Chalk, crushed eggshells, and sometimes even powdered pumice were common ingredients, applied to the teeth with a cloth or a frayed stick. These substances were abrasive enough to remove surface stains, but hardly effective against the germs or decay that caused persistent bad breath. If you thought a peppermint gum today was life-saving, imagine the anxiety of chewing chalk powder in preparation for a royal inspection. Courtiers often joked quietly, because joking too loudly could reach the king's ears, that the only real clean teeth at Versailles were the ones nature forgot to rot. Tongue hygiene was also a critical, though often neglected concern. Courtiers were well aware that odor emanated not just from teeth but from the tongue and throat. Herbal gargles, mouth rinses with rosewater or wine, and even chewing aromatic roots were employed in an effort to keep this hidden source of offensive smell under control. And yet, despite all these efforts, some courtiers were doomed from the start. A lifetime of poor diet, inherited dental weakness, or mere negligence could make passing the king's sniff test a Herculean task. It wasn't just a matter of personal hygiene, it was biology, luck, and the whims of the Sun King all rolled into one invisible battlefield. Medical myths of the period compounded the issue. Teeth were often believed to harbor illnesses, and bad breath was considered a possible indicator of imbalance in the body's humors. An unclean mouth could signify laziness, poor character, or even moral failings. The king's acute sense of smell turned this into an actual social risk, one poorly timed exhale, and a courtier might find themselves judged not just physically but ethically. The mouth became a mirror of the soul, and the tongue a messenger of virtue or vice. Some courtiers adopted more creative if desperate solutions. Chewing aromatic herbs all day became routine, leading to a peculiar landscape of parsley-stuffed pockets and secret clove stashes. Others experimented with fragrant powders sprinkled directly onto the teeth and gums. There were even whispered tales of courtiers drinking mint-infused wines or sucking on spiced candies to fool the king's nose. While clever, these strategies were far from foolproof. One accidental sneeze, one misjudged bite of cheese, and weeks of preparation could be undone in an instant. In the world of Versailles, the consequences of failing the olfactory gauntlet were immediate and occasionally humiliating. Diet, of course, played a decisive role in oral odor. Garlic, Onions, aged cheeses, and exotic imported spices were highly prized for flavor and social signaling, but they were absolute peril in proximity to the Sun King. Courtiers often faced a daily dilemma: indulge in culinary luxury and risk the sniff test, or play it safe with bland alternatives that could be endured without fear. For many, the decision was clear. Survival meant strategy. Recipes were adapted, meals carefully timed, and aromas constantly managed to avoid offending the king's highly sensitive nose. It was a world in which flavor, status, and breath were inseparably entangled. Ultimately, the dental and oral hygiene practices at Versailles reveal the lengths to which courtiers went to navigate a highly controlled, high-stakes social ecosystem. Every bite, chew, rinse, and herb was a calculated effort to maintain influence, avoid embarrassment, and stay within the favor of a monarch who treated breath as a proxy for character. Success meant social survival. Failure could mean subtle ostracism, whispered gossip, or the quiet embarrassment of knowing the king had registered your aromatic misstep. So when we imagine life at Versailles, it's not just about the grandeur of architecture or the opulence of fashion. It's about the small, invisible battles fought in the mouth, the chalks, the herbs, the powders, and the sacrifices to avoid a single misjudged exhale. For Louis XIV's courtiers, clean teeth and fresh breath were more than vanity. They were weapons, armor, and sometimes the difference between rising and falling in the most tightly controlled court in Europe. Brushing your teeth? Luxury. Passing the king's sniff test? A near impossible feat that required planning, skill, and a little luck. At Versailles, appearances were everything. But in Louis XIV's court, appearances weren't limited to clothes, posture, or powdered wigs. Breath itself became a symbol of social rank, a quiet but potent indicator of one's place in the intricate hierarchy of the Sun King's court. In a world where the king's nose could adjudicate your social standing, the state of your mouth was more than personal hygiene. It was a statement of privilege, wealth, and refinement. At Versailles, your breath could land you a promotion or exile to the broom closet. As courtiers liked to whisper in slightly panicked humor, wealthy courtiers had distinct advantages. They could afford specialized diets, aromatic herbs, and the finest perfumes, all carefully coordinated to keep their breath agreeable to the king's keen sense of smell. Delicate pastries, imported spices, and freshly harvested herbs were staples for those with money and influence, providing both flavor and aromatic camouflage. Some courtiers even employed personal attendants hidden behind the gilded curtains of salons to prepare aromatic mouth rinses or discreetly mask the traces of pungent food. This level of care allowed the elite to maintain a literal and figurative freshness that reinforced their social superiority. For the less fortunate, survival at court was far trickier. Poorer or lower-ranking courtiers had fewer resources for personal hygiene and culinary discretion. Without access to high-end perfumes or exotic herbs, they were more likely to be flagged during Louis XIV's sniffing rituals. Garlic-laden meals, tough bread, and preserved meats, all staples of modest diets, could betray them instantly. A courtesan with limited means might find herself avoided in conversation or subtly nudged away from critical social gatherings. In Versailles, wealth wasn't just wealth. It was a buffer against the judgment of the king's nose. Breath, therefore, functioned as a social currency. Just as powdered wigs and embroidered coats broadcasted status visually, scented breath signaled refinement audibly. Well, not audibly, but olfactorily. A pleasant aroma could elevate a courtier's standing, while an unfortunate whiff could humiliate them, regardless of other accomplishments or social connections. Courtiers quickly learned that personal scent management was an essential component of strategy. Meetings, duels of wits, and ceremonial duties could all hinge on the subtle olfactory impressions made in the presence of the Sun King. The stakes went beyond mere survival. Being perceived as fresh and fragrant could secure invitations to intimate gatherings, favor in the king's eyes, or even tangible promotions within courtly hierarchies. Conversely, a lapse in aromatic diligence could lead to subtle exile, reassignment to less prestigious duties, removal from ceremonial processions, or the dreaded social invisibility. often compared jokingly to being sent to the broom closet. In short, your mouth could determine your career trajectory as effectively as your lineage or political skill. Diet played a significant role in this status signaling. Courtiers with access to fine foods, fresh fruits, delicate pastries, tender meats, and imported delicacies had natural advantages in maintaining agreeable breath. Poorer courtiers, subsisting on coarse bread, aged cheeses, and heavily salted meats, faced a continuous uphill battle. Even if they masked odors with herbs or rinses, lingering effects could betray them at critical moments. It wasn't just a matter of olfactory offense, it was a daily, invisible contest of privilege versus survival. The link between breath and etiquette also reinforced the rigid hierarchies of Versailles. Those who could maintain freshness were considered disciplined, refined, and attentive to the king's preferences. Those who could not were judged as careless, uncouth, or even morally suspect. In essence, odor became a visible marker of social order, reinforcing the stratification of court life without a single word being spoken. A foul exhale was more than embarrassing. It was socially corrosive. Humor, as always, accompanied these high-stakes games. Courtiers would joke about perfume budgets and trade clandestine tips on what herbs neutralized the king's acute olfactory scrutiny. Tales circulated of ambitious young nobles failing to mask the after-effects of a garlic-heavy lunch and being relegated to corners of the palace where only broomsticks and dust mops dared to tread. For the court, it was a combination of horror and amusement, a reminder that status at Versailles was determined not just by ambition or birth, but by the state of your breath. Ultimately, the idea that breath signaled rank illuminates the intensity of life under Louis XIV. In a court obsessed with perfection, control, and display, every sensory detail mattered. Clothes, posture, manners, and yes, mouth odor were all battlegrounds where the elite asserted dominance and the lower ranks struggled for survival. The hierarchy of Versailles wasn't just seen, it was sniffed, measured, and subtly enforced with every exhale. So in Louis XIV's world, social mobility had an unusual barometer. A well-placed bow, a witty remark, or a polished shoe could help, but nothing spoke louder or more pungently than the state of your breath. At Versailles, it was a lesson in power, privilege, and olfactory strategy. Master your aromas, and you could climb the courtly ladder. Fail, and you might find yourself hiding behind the broom closet, praying your garlic lunch goes unnoticed. Versailles was a palace of beauty, power, and intrigue, but beneath the glittering chandeliers and meticulously trimmed gardens lurked an invisible threat, the king's nose. Louis XIV's obsession with breath transformed the simplest bodily function into a potential cause for scandal, gossip, and humiliation. For courtiers, one poorly timed exhale could ignite whispers that spread faster than a fire through the palace's oak-paneled corridors. Nothing says royal betrayal like your garlic morning snack being discovered by the Sun King. A wryly nervous courtier might joke, though behind the humor lurked genuine fear. Documented incidents show just how seriously the king took olfactory offenses. One courtesan reportedly approached the king after indulging in a breakfast of onions and mustard, only to be discreetly withdrawn from the audience before a single word was spoken. Another nobleman, whose diet included heavily spiced cheeses, was said to have endured the subtle grimace of the king, a reaction that became the talk of the salons for weeks. While Louis XIV rarely punished these lapses formally, the social repercussions could be devastating. Whispered ridicule, exclusion from key gatherings, or quiet demotion within ceremonial hierarchies. The court was fertile ground for gossip, and the king's sniffing habits amplified it. Courtiers would circulate stories about who had survived the king's scrutiny and who had failed spectacularly. Secret nicknames emerged, like the Garlic Ghost or Onion Earl, applied to those whose aromatic offenses were notorious. These labels weren't just for amusement, they shaped reputations, alliances, and even marriages. A bad sniff could render months of careful politicking useless, demonstrating that in Louis XIV's Versailles, breath could wield more power than wit or charm. Daily life was profoundly shaped by this obsession. Courtiers planned schedules around the king's routine, timing meals and herbal preparations to avoid aromatic mistakes. A breakfast too early or too aromatic could ruin an entire morning of courtly activities. Even private conversations were conducted with care. One might step outside to chew a clove, rinse with rosewater, or discreetly fan oneself before engaging in discussion near the Sun King. Every social interaction became a potential minefield, a delicate choreography of words, gestures, and crucially scents. The psychological impact was equally significant. Courtiers were constantly aware that their very bodies could betray them, and this heightened awareness influenced behavior, attire, and even posture. Anxiety about breath could lead to obsessive habits. Repeated brushing, frequent herbal chewing, or overly meticulous use of perfumes. While intended to protect reputation, these routines often created tension, stress, and even comedic mishaps when herbs or powders were spilled at the worst possible moment. Imagine a courtier bowing deeply, only to sneeze out a clove in front of the king, a small aromatic catastrophe worthy of whispered retellings for years. Interestingly, the king's obsession also shaped relationships within the court. Courtiers learned to observe each other carefully, noting who carried the most effective herbal sachets, who dined too boldly, and who might be vulnerable to sniff-induced humiliation. Alliances were sometimes forged based on olfactory strategy, with trusted aides sharing tips or lending aromatic aids to those in need. Conversely, rivalries flourished when one noble's aromatic offense became fodder for gossip, creating a subtle network of power, leverage, and laughter that operated beneath the veneer of courtly grace. Some incidents reached legendary status. One story recounts a nobleman, famed for his spicy breakfast habits, being ushered awkwardly out of the king's presence while the courtiers held their noses discreetly behind silk fans. Another tale tells of a visiting ambassador, unaware of the stringent aroma standards, who unwittingly provoked a ripple of stifled giggles and sharp whispers when his garlic-laden exhale reached Louis XIV. These episodes became teaching tools for newcomers to court, serving as cautionary tales about the potentially career-altering power of a single offensive whiff. Of course, humor often tempered the fear. Courtiers wrote poems, composed witty epigrams, and whispered jokes about sniff scandals behind closed doors. Yet beneath the levity was a clear social lesson. Life at Versailles demanded vigilance in every detail, including the invisible and sometimes deadly realm of aroma. To fail was not simply to offend the king, it was to invite ridicule, erode influence, and risk being sidelined in one of the most politically charged and meticulously organized courts in Europe. Louis XIV's obsession with breath, and the scandals it created, serves as a reminder of how absolute power penetrates the most intimate corners of life. Even something as mundane as what one eats for breakfast, how one chews, or which herbs one carries could dictate fortune or misfortune. At Versailles, the courtier's survival depended on vigilance, strategy, and a keen sense of aromatic awareness, skills as critical as diplomacy, wit, or fashion. In the end, the stories of sniff-induced embarrassment are both funny and revealing. They show how power, fear, and humor intertwined in a court obsessed with perfection, and how a single garlic clove or poorly chosen herb could ignite ripples of scandal that shaped careers, marriages, and reputations. In Louis XIV's world, it was clear. When it came to survival at court, nothing was more personal or potentially catastrophic than your breath. Louis XIV wasn't just a king, he was an institution of control, a living emblem of absolute monarchy, and as it turns out, a connoisseur of human aroma. His obsession with smelling courtiers' breath offers a fascinating lens into his psychology, revealing a man consumed by perfection, paranoia, and the tiniest details of daily life. In Versailles, where gold leaf and silk ruled the eye, the nose quietly reigned supreme, shaping behavior, alliances, and the delicate balance of social power. At its core, this preoccupation speaks to Louis XIV's desire for control. To the Sun King, nothing was trivial, not the order of footmen, the alignment of mirrors, or the scent emanating from a noble's mouth. By literally sniffing his courtiers, he asserted dominance in a deeply personal and symbolic way. The act itself was a statement. I own not only your position and your loyalty, but also the very molecules leaving your body. While other monarchs might have relied on spies, courtly etiquette, or ceremonial inspections, Louis XIV turned the invisible into an instrument of authority. Every sniff was an assertion of power, a reminder that the king's influence extended into every corner of courtly life, even the air you exhaled. Paranoia also played a role. Louis XIV's court was a complex ecosystem, teeming with rivalries, secrets, and ambitious courtiers eager to rise or sabotage one another. In such an environment, trust was fragile. The king's obsession with olfactory scrutiny reflects a mind attuned to potential threats in the smallest details. Bad breath could indicate illness, negligence, or disrespect, signals of unreliability or moral laxity. By monitoring these subtle cues, Louis XIV maintained a constant awareness of his surroundings, reducing uncertainty in a court where even a whispered insult could escalate into political peril. His sniffing was a strategy, a tool for maintaining vigilance, and a manifestation of an almost compulsive desire to know everything, however microscopic, about those in his orbit. Obsessions with order and perfection were woven into the very fabric of the Sun King's personality. He famously declared, "L'été c'est moi," I am the state, and his meticulous attention to appearances, rituals, and courtly behavior extended to the olfactory realm. Smelling courtiers' breath wasn't mere curiosity, it was a continuation of his broader philosophy that perfection must be maintained in every detail of governance, social life, and self-presentation. Just as he orchestrated elaborate ceremonies and dictated dress codes, he controlled the intimate and invisible realm of scent, ensuring that even the unspoken and unsaid adhered to his standard of excellence. Louis XIV's peculiar obsession also places him in a wider context of historical rulers with strange habits. Monarchs have long been known for their quirks. King Charles VI of France feared he was made of glass. Ivan the Terrible reportedly killed people on impulse, and Caligula once declared war on Neptune. While these habits may seem bizarre, they reveal a common theme. Absolute power often magnifies personal eccentricities. Louis XIV's choice of obsession or faction is unique in its intimacy and social ramifications. Unlike coin collecting, palace renovations, or exotic animal menageries, sniffing human breath directly impacted interpersonal dynamics, hierarchies, and courtly survival. Whereas other rulers pursued grand displays, the Sun King's focus was microscopic, personal, and oddly poetic in its assertion of dominion over the senses. Humor, of course, finds its place in this unusual psychological profile. While most monarchs collected coins, fine art, or exotic curiosities, Louis XIV collected olfactory data, a living catalogue of who smelled pleasant, who required masking, and who posed subtle threats to decorum. Courtiers, for their part, developed elaborate routines to navigate this invisible scrutiny, creating a symphony of perfumes, herbs, and powders. From a modern perspective, one might picture the king sitting in his golden chair, notebook, or more likely his memory at the ready, silently annotating the aromatic landscape of Versailles, his own version of an olfactory census. Louis XIV's sniffing obsession also underscores the psychological weight of absolute power. When one person wields complete authority over life, fortune, and social standing, even small details acquire extraordinary significance. The king's olfactory vigilance wasn't merely whimsical. It was a reflection of the stakes of maintaining control, loyalty, and hierarchy in a court of intrigue. Every breath, every scent was a signal, and the king's mind was tuned to interpret them. In a world where a misstep could cost influence or reputation, his compulsive monitoring made sense, however unusual it may appear to modern observers. Ultimately, the Sun King's peculiar habit reveals a man who fused power, obsession, and sensory control into a singular approach to rulership. By integrating the invisible smells, exhalations, subtle aromas into his management of the court, Louis XIV exemplified the extremes of absolute monarchy. He turned breath into both a tool of surveillance and a medium of social engineering, demonstrating that even the most intimate human functions could be harnessed for authority. So, while historians marvel at Versailles' grandeur and marvel at the Sun King's political genius, they must also marvel at the smaller, stranger details. A king who sniffed, evaluated, and sometimes judged his courtiers with nothing more than a sensitive nose and an unyielding will for perfection. It was personal, it was obsessive, and it was undeniably Louis XIV. Louis XIV died in 1715, but his obsession with breath left a legacy that outlived him, lingering in the annals of history and in the imagination of anyone who has ever wondered about the quirks of absolute power. The Sun King's meticulous sniffing may seem absurd, but it reshaped French court etiquette, influenced cultural perceptions of hygiene and refinement, and became one of the more amusing footnotes of history. He's gone, but somewhere in Versailles his nose still judges us, one might quip, and in many ways that's not far from the truth. The first and most obvious legacy is in courtly etiquette itself. Louis XIV's focus on breath and scent extended the boundaries of what it meant to be polished in 17th century France. Social rituals increasingly incorporated olfactory considerations. Courtiers carried fans not just to flutter gracefully, but to subtly diffuse scents. Perfume application became an essential skill, not a luxury, and etiquette guides began mentioning the importance of aromatic management alongside posture, language, and dress. In this sense, the Sun King didn't just rule through legislation, he ruled through the very air of the court, transforming scent into an instrument of refinement, influence, and survival. His obsession also influenced French hygiene practices more broadly. While the modern concept of dental care was centuries away, the court's emphasis on masking and managing odor inspired innovations in perfume, mouth rinses, and scented powders. The idea that one's scent could affect social standing seeped into broader society, helping France become renowned for fragrance production and an enduring appreciation for personal grooming. One could argue that the world's fascination with French perfume and meticulous personal care owes a tiny debt to a king who sniffed courtiers with almost militaristic precision. Culturally, Louis XIV's sniffing habits offer an enduring reminder that odd personal quirks can define historical memory. History tends to remember not just the grand events, wars, treaties, and architectural triumphs, but also the small human details that reveal personality. The king's nose, for instance, has become shorthand for the peculiar intimacy of absolute power. Historians, writers, and storytellers continue to recount these anecdotes because they are funny, humanizing, and extraordinary in a court otherwise dominated by pomp and gravity. A man who could orchestrate wars, regulate taxation, and oversee the construction of Versailles is remembered as much for sniffing garlic-laden courtiers as for any political achievement. There's also a broader lesson in how such eccentricities influence public fascination with history. Odd habits like the Sun King's sniffing, Peter the Great's insistence on swimming in icy rivers, or Caligula's horses attending the Senate, offer windows into the psychology of power, revealing the interplay between personality, authority, and social dynamics. They humanize the otherwise monumental figures of history, allowing us to connect with them in ways that are simultaneously humorous and illuminating. For Louis XIV, the narrative of the sniffing king makes the opulence of Versailles relatable. It's not just gilded halls and glittering wigs, but a living, breathing world shaped by quirks, anxieties, and the very human obsession with control. Interestingly, the legacy of his olfactory obsession persists in modern storytelling. Books, documentaries, and online content continue to highlight these strange details, often as gateways to understanding broader social and political systems. The anecdotes about sniffing courtiers are particularly resonant because they mix humor with insight, illustrating how even small personal peculiarities can ripple outward into lasting cultural memory. When we laugh at the idea of a king cataloguing his subjects' breath, we're also recognizing the universality of human obsession, idiosyncrasy, and the desire to control our environment, even in the tiniest ways. Even today, museums, tours, and historical reenactments of Versailles playfully reference the Sun King's nose, Guides point out where courtiers may have paused, prepared, or perfumed themselves before an audience. Visitors are encouraged to imagine the tension, the elaborate routines, and the subtle strategies employed to survive under the scrutiny of a monarch whose senses were as sharp as his political instincts. The imagery of an invisible olfactory ruler, silently judging from the gilded throne, adds both levity and depth to our understanding of court life, ensuring that the king's peculiar obsession continues to captivate and amuse centuries later. Ultimately, Louis XIV's sniffing habits are more than mere historical oddity. They are a reflection of the intersection of power, human psychology, and social control. They remind us that even absolute monarchs are shaped by their idiosyncrasies, and that small personal rituals can leave outsized impressions on culture, etiquette, and memory. His legacy is thus double-edged, a testament to his brilliance as a ruler and a delightful window into the quirks that made him unmistakably human. So, as we stroll through the halls of Versailles today, taking in the fountains, mirrors, and gilded ceilings, it's worth pausing to imagine the Sun King's invisible nose floating above, still judging, still sniffing, and still shaping the stories we tell about opulence, etiquette, and the curious, enduring power of human obsession. History remembers not just the king, but the scent of his reign, and in that sense, Louis XIV's legacy is as fragrant as it is unforgettable. Picture this. It's the year 1400-something. Europe is in the throes of the late Middle Ages, a time when fashion included pointy shoes that could double as a weapon, and dinner might consist of mystery meat that had been staring at you longer than your cat. Amid all this medieval chaos, some people weren't just content with surviving plagues and bad plumbing, they were building mechanical humans. Yes, actual robots. Though the term robot wouldn't be invented for another 500 years. Back then, these were called automata, a fancy word for things that move on their own, usually scaring the neighbors. So what exactly is an automaton? In the simplest terms, it's a mechanical device designed to mimic life. That could mean a bird flapping its wings and singing, a knight clanging armor while marching across a table, or even a little humanoid that pours wine for your feudal overlord, provided you didn't mind a splash to the face. Imagine a robot that can wave hello, if only waving was as simple as turning a crank and hoping it doesn't break. The ingenuity here is staggering. Unlike modern robots that require software, Wi-Fi, and 37 different updates before you can even get them to vacuum, medieval automata were purely mechanical marvels: gears, pulleys, weights, and sometimes a small reservoir of water if the designer was feeling ambitious. And the people behind these contraptions were no ordinary tinkers. They were engineers, mathematicians, and dreamers who looked at the world and said, "I bet I can make that tree move on its own, using only wood, metal, and sheer stubbornness." One of the earliest known European figures dabbling in mechanical wonders was Villard de Honnecourt, a 13th century French architect who carried a sketchbook that was basically the medieval equivalent of Pinterest boards filled with moving animals, humans, and mysterious contraptions. His drawings reveal a fascination with motion, gears, and automata designs that seemed centuries ahead of their time. And Villard wasn't alone across the Mediterranean. In the Middle East, Al-Jazari was crafting complex machines like humanoid musicians and water clocks, while Europe was still figuring out how to make a catapult work without decimating its own castle. Al-Jazari's workshop was humming with clocks and moving figures that could tell time and play music with terrifying precision. But why were these medieval engineers so obsessed with building mechanical people? Curiosity mostly. Humans have always been fascinated by the idea of mimicking life. Why make a simple wooden chair when you can make a wooden bird that not only sits but also sings, flaps, and possibly insults you in the process? There was also a hefty dose of prestige involved. Automata were the ultimate show-off devices. A noble or king who could afford a mechanical lion that roared on command instantly became the Renaissance equivalent of a social media influencer. "Look at me, peasants. My lion can roar while your cow just chews grass." The craftsmanship that went into these machines is nothing short of breathtaking. Every gear had to fit perfectly. every lever calibrated and every weight balanced. One misplaced cog, and your carefully constructed mechanical servant might do something unexpected, like launching a bucket of water across the hall or spinning in endless circles until it fell apart. The good news, these machines could do a trick. The bad news, they could also break down mid-performance, usually on royalty. Imagine sitting through a royal feast as a tiny automaton attempts to pour wine, only for the mechanical arm to fling it across the banquet hall. Delightful chaos ensues. It's also important to note that automata weren't just toys or curiosities. They were experiments, a way for medieval minds to explore physics, engineering, and the very idea of life itself. In an era when most people thought science was a synonym for guessing and hoping for the best, creating a mechanical human was a bold statement. We can mimic God's creation sort of sometimes, if we remember which gear goes where. So, as we step into the world of medieval automata, prepare to meet mechanical monks that pray, birds that sing, and machines that march with a dignity only slightly less impressive than their human counterparts. This is a world where curiosity outweighed practicality, craftsmanship flirted with madness, and imagination had no limits. A world where gears could be poetic, pulleys were magical, and the simple act of making a robot wave could take a lifetime of trial, error, and perhaps a minor explosion or two. Welcome to the age of clockwork madness, a time when humans looked at life and said, "We can build that, and probably break it spectacularly." And trust me, you'll want to see just how spectacularly. So, we've met the mechanical marvels of the Middle Ages, but now a more pressing question arises. Why on earth would anyone in the 1400s spend months or even years building a robot when a regular human could do the job just fine, and often with fewer explosions? The answer is simple. Because humans have always craved entertainment, prestige, and a little bit of chaos. And let's be honest, the Middle Ages weren't exactly brimming with Netflix series or TikTok challenges, so if you wanted to impress your guests at court, you needed something a little more animated. Automata first and foremost served as entertainment. Picture a grand hall in a European castle. Tapestries line the walls, servants scurry about, and the lord of the manor has invited nobles for a feast. Suddenly, a mechanical bird flutters down from the ceiling, chirping a tune so precisely that it could rival a live minstrel. Your guests are delighted, slightly horrified, and utterly confused about whether to clap or bow. They didn't have Netflix, so they built a metal bird that sings, and it probably sang better than the court musicians, which was both impressive and career-threatening. Entertainment was not just about fun, it was about the spectacle of ingenuity, and automata delivered in spades. From mechanical lions that roared to moving angels in cathedral displays, the Middle Ages were a time when awe was the ultimate applause meter. Beyond entertainment, automata were status symbols. In a world where titles, land, and wealth determined your social power, having a mechanical monk that could bow, pray, and occasionally spill holy water was the ultimate flex. Building and commissioning automata demonstrated wealth, taste, and access to the rare combination of skilled craftsmen and expensive materials. Nobles would proudly show off their mechanical menagerie to visiting dignitaries, because nothing says "I am important" quite like a robot serving your wine, playing a lute, or performing a mechanical dance while you pretend you didn't just almost trip over a rogue laver. These machines were like the medieval equivalent of owning a private jet, except with more gears and significantly more chances of catastrophic failure. Automata were also used to showcase scientific ingenuity, the kind of experimentation that would eventually lay the groundwork for modern engineering. Creating a moving humanoid or a water-powered musical instrument required a sophisticated understanding of mechanics, hydraulics, and timing. Engineers had to calculate gear ratios, measure weights precisely, and plan intricate sequences of motion, all without the luxury of modern tools or calculators. A functioning automaton wasn't just impressive, it was proof that its creator could command nature's principles, bending water, air, and gravity into obedient motion. Imagine telling your neighbors, "Yes, my mechanical knight can joust," And yes, I did design him using only ink, wood, and sheer stubbornness. Prestige aside, automata were a statement. We are cleverer than you, also slightly insane. But not all mechanical wonders were purely for spectacle. Some automata had practical applications, often disguised as courtly curiosities. Take, for example, water clocks, machines designed to measure time using the steady flow of water, sometimes enhanced with moving figures that would mark hours with dramatic gestures. These were essentially medieval multitaskers. They told time, impressed visitors, and sometimes performed a little show, like a miniature figure striking a bell with a hammer. The idea that a machine could both tick-tock and entertain would have seemed magical to anyone living in a world where most peasants thought daylight and candlelight were the height of technology. Even automata built for purely functional purposes, like fountains that spouted water in rhythm, were treated as status symbols, because if your fountain could dance to imaginary music, everyone else's fountain suddenly looked like a sad puddle. Then there's the sheer thrill of novelty. Humans have always loved things that move in unexpected ways, and the Middle Ages were no exception. Watching a mechanical monk pray for 3 hours may not sound like a rager to us today, but back then, it was cutting-edge entertainment. Guests could marvel at the precision, wonder at the ingenuity, and whisper nervously to each other about whether these machines were powered by witchcraft. In a time when superstition was rampant, and science was often indistinguishable from magic, automata had the perfect combination of fascination and fear. They were entertaining, impressive, and just a touch unnerving, a trifecta that guaranteed your invention would be talked about long after the feast ended. So why did people build robots in the Middle Ages? For entertainment, prestige, scientific exploration, practical utility, and yes, the sheer thrill of proving you could out-engineer everyone else at the court. They were clever, sometimes functional, often temperamental, and always spectacularly impressive. In short, automata were the ultimate middle-aged party trick, designed to awe, amuse, and occasionally terrify. In the next chapter, we'll meet some of the legendary medieval machines themselves, from mechanical lions to singing birds, and see exactly how these devices blended artistry, engineering, and a healthy dose of mechanical chaos. But for now, just remember, the Middle Ages may not have had video games, but they had moving, singing, praying robots. And honestly, that's probably way cooler. By now you might be wondering, all this talk of automata is fascinating, but did these mechanical marvels actually exist, or were they just the fever dreams of overambitious inventors with too much free time? Fear not. The Middle Ages had machines that would make even the most advanced modern robots raise an eyebrow, or at least short-circuit with envy. Let's take a guided tour through some of the most legendary medieval machines that combined artistry, engineering, and occasionally a dash of terrifying unpredictability. First up, Al-Jazari's elephant clock. Picture this, a 12-foot-tall mechanical elephant made from wood, brass, and a healthy dose of genius, carrying a rotating platform with a sultan, a mechanical bird, and a tiny humanoid drummer who probably had better timing than most human musicians of the era. The elephant clock wasn't just a timepiece, it was a statement. The good people of Baghdad may have sun and sand, but we have an elephant that tells time. The clock operated through a clever combination of water flow, weights, and gears. As water slowly emptied from one reservoir to another, levers and pulleys activated a sequence of figures, each performing its preordained action. The elephant would trumpet, well, in imagination if not actual sound. The bird would flap, and the humanoid drummer would beat his tiny drum. The elephant clock. Because nothing says I am sophisticated, like telling time with a miniature pachyderm. And yes, this isn't your Roomba. This is a gear-filled mechanical elephant that might crush your toes if you're careless. Moving from the deserts of the Middle East to the rolling hills of England, we meet Richard of Wallingford's astronomical clock. Now, clocks in the Middle Ages weren't just about telling whether it was time for lunch or execution. They were about tracking celestial events, tides, and the passage of time in a way that made astrologers look like wizards. Wallingford, a monk with an obsession for gears and heavenly bodies, designed a clock that could predict lunar phases, the positions of planets, and even the times for church prayers. Think of it as a medieval smartwatch. If your smartwatch required daily manual winding and came with a risk of spontaneous gear rebellion. Wallingford's clock was a masterpiece of precision engineering, combining scientific observation with the aesthetic flourish of a monastery workshop. The attention to detail was so meticulous that it could confuse even the most mathematically inclined visitor, leaving them to mutter, "Did he just make a machine that predicts the stars, or am I hallucinating from the incense?" Then there's Villard de Honnecourt, whose fame rests not on finished machines but on the astonishing sketches he left behind. His 13th century sketchbook is a treasure trove of moving figures, mechanical animals, and fantastical contraptions that might have existed only in theory, or maybe in his workshop, quietly plotting mechanical revolt. Villard's designs show a remarkable understanding of motion and mechanics, from humanoid figures with articulated limbs to birds that flap their wings. These drawings reveal a mind obsessed with capturing life in motion. They are a kind of blueprint for the imagination, instructions for a world in which gears could mimic the complexity of living creatures. Villard wasn't merely inventing machines, he was inventing possibility, showing that the line between art, engineering, and madness is delightfully thin. Other legendary machines, less famous but equally ambitious, included automated fountains where mechanical animals would spout water in perfect rhythm, and mechanical musicians capable of performing intricate compositions by themselves. Nobles and kings commissioned these devices not only to impress guests, but to create a sense of wonder, like a living, moving museum exhibit. Watching these machines work could inspire awe, suspicion, or mild panic, especially if one of the figures decided to misfire, spray water on an unsuspecting courtier, or collapse entirely mid-performance. Such was the thrill of medieval mechanical life. The closer it came to reality, the greater the chance it would betray you spectacularly. What's remarkable is how these machines combined functionality with storytelling. Al-Jazari's elephant wasn't just a clock, it was a miniature stage, a performance packed into wood and metal. Wallingford's astronomical clock wasn't just a scientific instrument, it was a cosmic drama that told the tale of the heavens. Villard de Honnecourt's sketches weren't merely engineering plans, they were imaginative narratives, a glimpse into a mind where animals, humans, and gears coexisted in a carefully choreographed dance. In other words, these machines weren't just tools, they were medieval blockbusters, designed to dazzle, educate, and occasionally terrify. And yes, let's not forget the slightly terrifying reality. Unlike your modern appliances, these machines were prone to dramatic failure. A gear might slip, a weight could drop prematurely, or a mechanical bird could start flapping wildly, showering everyone in water or alarming the court's cats. It's a reminder that in the Middle Ages, being impressed often came with a risk of personal injury, which somehow made the spectacle even more memorable. In sum, the legendary machines of the medieval world were as much works of art as they were engineering feats. They entertained, educated, and showed off their owners' wealth and ingenuity. They were daring, imaginative, and occasionally dangerous. They combined gears and creativity in ways that still leave modern engineers scratching their heads, and historians marveling at the audacity of their creators. If you ever doubted that the Middle Ages were boring, just remember, somewhere, a mechanical elephant was telling time, a monk was marching endlessly in a clock, and a bird was singing better than your local minstrel, all while the human audience cheered, gasped, and hoped nothing exploded. Welcome to the legendary world of medieval machines, where imagination turned metal and wood into life, spectacle, and just a touch of mechanical chaos. So far we've admired medieval automata, marveled at their spectacle, and even laughed at the occasional rogue elephant or mechanical monk. But now the question arises, how did these medieval machines actually move? How could a wooden bird flap its wings, a miniature drummer strike in rhythm, or a mechanical lion roar without the magic of electricity, batteries, or even AAA cells? The answer lies in the clever, if occasionally terrifying, world of medieval mechanics. At the heart of most automata were gears, pulleys, weights, and water, the basic building blocks of motion before electricity made things simpler. These devices relied on transferring energy from one component to another in a precise sequence, a process that required both mathematical understanding and a generous dose of trial and error. Imagine a clockwork bird. Its wings flap because a set of gears driven by a falling weight turns a crankshaft, which moves a series of levers connected to the wings. The bird's head might nod thanks to a tiny cam that rises and falls, while a whistle produces a chirp in perfect timing. Gears turning, ropes pulling, water dripping. Basically, medieval engineering was hope this works, and if not, pray. Water clocks were a particularly clever and sometimes terrifying example of how medieval engineers harnessed simple physics to power complex motions. A water clock worked by allowing water to flow from one vessel to another at a steady rate. As the water level changed, it would raise or lower a float, which in turn moved levers and gears connected to figures, bells, or indicators of time. Think of it as a liquid-powered automaton. Drip, 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 and suddenly a mechanical monk raises his hands in prayer. The precision of these clocks was remarkable given the tools available. Unfortunately, they were also messy, leak-prone, and prone to turning your finely tuned automaton into a soggy paperweight if you forgot to refill the reservoir or accidentally knocked over the bucket. Weights, often made of stone or metal, were another source of energy. In many mechanical clocks, a weight would slowly descend, pulling on a rope wound around a drum. This rotation powered the gears that set figures in motion or kept time. Some automata even combined weights with water reservoirs, creating hybrid systems where dripping water released a weight, which then turned a gear, which then flapped a bird's wings. It's like medieval Rube Goldberg machines, except instead of making toast, they made a tiny musician perform a flawless solo for your amusement. Another critical innovation was the escapement, a device that controlled the release of energy from a weight or spring. Without an escapement, your automaton would either move too fast, like a caffeinated rooster, or too slow, drifting through motions at a pace that suggested deep existential contemplation. Escapements acted like the nervous system of the machine, regulating movement to simulate lifelike behavior. With them, a mechanical figure could wave a hand, drum a tiny instrument, or strike a bell with startling accuracy, all without spinning wildly out of control. Essentially, it was a medieval please don't break everything system. Motion was then transferred through levers, cams, and pulleys, converting rotational energy into linear or oscillatory movement. A cam might lift a lever which pushed a rod which made a hand wave or a head nod. Pulleys could redirect forces, allowing movement along unexpected paths. Every automaton was a miniature mechanical theatre, a choreography of gears, ropes, and weights designed to mimic life, or at least life as medieval engineers imagined it. And yes, medieval robots were impressive, except when they refused to work and became glorified paperweights. Nothing inspires awe like a finely crafted mechanical lion that spends the entire banquet lying on its side while the court musicians try not to laugh. Some automata even used hydraulics to enhance movement. Tiny pumps, siphons, and water channels could move figures, spray fountains, or activate other components. One can imagine the delight or horror of a noble watching a mechanical dragon suddenly spray water across the hall, drenching their carefully arranged feast. Hydraulics were especially tricky because water is unpredictable, too much pressure, and a lever snaps, too little, and the automaton just stares blankly, as if mocking your attempts at sophistication. What's fascinating is that every mechanical choice, gear size, lever length, weight, cam shape, affected the personality of the automaton. Some flapped energetically, some moved gracefully, and some just jerked around awkwardly, like a puppet having a very bad day. In a way, malfunctioning automata were early slapstick comedians, performing entirely unintentional routines that delighted audiences far more than the intended motions. In essence, the mechanics of medieval automata were a delicate blend of physics, ingenuity, and optimism. Designers had to calculate, experiment, and anticipate failure at every turn. They had no motors, no circuits, no software, just a deep understanding of motion and an almost reckless confidence that a few wooden gears, a bit of rope, and a bucket of water could simulate life. And when they worked, even imperfectly, they were astonishing. Birds sang, drummers drummed, and tiny knights clanged their armor as if the divine order of gears had briefly aligned with human imagination. So the next time you marvel at a modern robot or automated device, remember that 600 years ago, humans achieved the impossible with wood, water, and sheer audacity. Gears turned, levers lifted, and water dripped in synchrony to create machines that were both functional and absurdly entertaining. In short, medieval engineers didn't just build automata, they built lifelike chaos in motion, one gear at a time. Medieval automata weren't just feats of engineering, they were the rock stars of the royal courts. Imagine walking into a great hall, tapestries rustling, nobles adjusting their pointy hats, only to be greeted by a tiny mechanical bird flapping across the room in perfect rhythm, or a miniature knight jousting with a companion while a fountain of water arcs gracefully or unpredictably over the audience. For royalty and nobles, automata were the ultimate crowd pleasers, a way to showcase wealth, ingenuity, and a flair for the dramatic. Courtly entertainment in the Middle Ages was a delicate mix of pomp, performance, and subtle threats of humiliation for anyone who misbehaved. Automata added a mechanical layer of awe that human performers couldn't always match. Dancing birds with articulated wings, mechanical monkeys striking drums, or tiny knights marching in synchrony were far more reliable than your average bard, at least in theory. These machines created a spectacle that left guests whispering, "Who designed this? And can they make one for my manor?" The spectacle wasn't just for amusement. It was a demonstration of the host's taste, sophistication, and technical savvy. If you could commission a mechanical dragon that spit water across the hall without drenching the king, you were basically the VIP of medieval innovation. Of course, shock value was a large part of the appeal. Mechanical devices could surprise, delight, and occasionally terrify. Imagine a mechanical knight lunging forward during a jousting demonstration. If everything worked perfectly, it was an elegant display of precision engineering. If not, well, let's just say that the knight might take a swing at a noble's hand, or knock over a candelabra, instantly converting admiration into panic. These mechanical knights would joust, provided you didn't mind losing a finger or your dignity. The stakes made the spectacle far more thrilling than a simple stage performance. Audiences loved the tension of uncertainty. Would the machine perform flawlessly? Or would chaos erupt in a shower of gears, water, and embarrassment? Either way, it was memorable. Automata were also a favorite in religious or public spectacles, where the line between entertainment and moral instruction often blurred. Cathedrals and churches sometimes installed moving angels, mechanical crucifixes, or automated figures that performed prayers or gestures during ceremonies. These devices inspired awe in worshippers, convincing them that divine power had a very precise gear ratio. Outside sacred spaces, townsfolk could witness public displays featuring mechanical animals or birds, fountains that moved in rhythm, or even clockwork dragons. Imagine the town crier announcing, "Come witness the mechanical rooster that will crow maybe," and watching as a tiny metal bird flaps its wings while dripping water onto unsuspecting children. These machines made ordinary days feel extraordinary, blending spectacle with a subtle reminder of human ingenuity, or perhaps of how easily things could go wrong. Beyond the spectacle, automata offered a playful commentary on society and power. Mechanical figures could mimic nobility, soldiers, or clergy, creating a subtle form of satire that only the cleverest observers would notice. A mechanical monk bowing excessively or a tiny knight spinning in place could elicit laughter while also subtly highlighting human foibles. Automata were like medieval political cartoons, except instead of ink on parchment, they involved wood, metal, water, and a healthy dose of mechanical unpredictability. It's also worth noting that automata could enhance the host's mystique. If a noble could casually unveil a mechanical musician during a feast, it suggested not just wealth, but access to hidden knowledge. Guests would leave the hall impressed and slightly intimidated, wondering whether their host had discovered some secret power of nature. A functioning automaton was more than a toy. It was a statement. I command wood, water, and metal. Do not underestimate me. The combination of elegance, technical skill, and shock factor made these machines irresistible for anyone with ambition, vanity, or a flair for dramatic entrances. Of course, there were risks. Mechanical devices could be unpredictable, and a single misaligned gear or bucket of water could turn a demonstration into an accidental slapstick show. But in the medieval mindset, the potential for chaos only increased entertainment value. A mechanical lion might roar too loudly, a water fountain might soak an unlucky noble, or a mechanical jester could go rogue, spinning in endless circles. Audiences learned to expect the unexpected, and sometimes the machine's failure was as memorable and amusing as its intended function. Ultimately, automata in medieval society weren't just machines. They were performance, spectacle, and social commentary all rolled into one. They entertained, shocked, and impressed, often simultaneously. They were a way for royalty and nobles to flaunt wealth and ingenuity, for craftsmen to showcase skill, and for audiences to experience the thrill of mechanical life without leaving their seats. A mechanical bird, a jousting knight, or a dancing fountain wasn't just entertainment. It was a tiny marvel of engineering and imagination, a showstopper that combined technical brilliance with humor, awe, and just a hint of danger. In the courts, churches, and public squares of the Middle Ages, automata transformed ordinary life into a stage, blending wonder with amusement and sometimes a mild dose of chaos. They reminded everyone that human creativity could animate wood and metal in ways that were both fascinating and delightfully unpredictable. And while modern audiences might be more impressed by flashing lights or surround sound, medieval spectators knew the true thrill, watching a mechanical rooster, a tiny knight, or a flapping bird and wondering, will it work or will it crash spectacularly? If you've been following along by now, you've seen medieval automata in action, elephants telling time, mechanical monks praying, and knights jousting with charmingly unpredictable precision. But beyond the spectacle, these machines were far more than toys or curiosities. They were experiments in science, engineering, and imagination, proof that humans have long sought to turn magic into mechanics. In fact, the medieval automata tradition laid the foundation for centuries of technological innovation, influencing engineers, clockmakers, and eventually the very concept of robotics. At their core, automata advanced the understanding of gears, timing, and hydraulics. Consider the complex interplay of gears in a mechanical bird or a water clock. Each gear ratio, each lever, each cam and pulley required careful calculation. Engineers had to anticipate how much torque a weight could provide, how fast a water reservoir would empty, and how these forces would translate into motion. It wasn't guesswork entirely, though a healthy dose of hope and prayer didn't hurt, but precise mechanical reasoning. Medieval engineers were, in essence, laying the groundwork for modern kinematics centuries before Newton formalized physics. Every rotating gear, every oscillating lever was a tiny experiment in motion, energy transfer, and synchronization. Hydraulics played a particularly important role. Many automata relied on the controlled flow of water to activate movement, raising figures, spinning wheels, or triggering hidden mechanisms. Understanding fluid dynamics in these early devices helped engineers refine concepts of pressure, flow, and force. While they might not have been scribbling down formulas in the style of Isaac Newton or Leonardo da Vinci, the trial-and-error experiments of medieval automata builders were scientific exercises in their own right. Each failure taught something new. Too much water, and the machine became a fountain of chaos. Too little, and it simply sulked in place like a temperamental servant. Either way, valuable lessons were learned. The influence of these machines didn't stop in the Middle Ages. When the Renaissance dawned, engineers and clockmakers looked back at automata as sources of inspiration. Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, sketched humanoid robots capable of limited movement, and many Renaissance inventors drew on the mechanical principles pioneered by their medieval predecessors. The study of gears, cams, and pulleys evolved into sophisticated clockwork mechanisms that measured time with unprecedented accuracy. Complex musical automata followed, blending art, engineering, and performance in ways that delighted aristocrats across Europe. Medieval automata had essentially taught humanity that mechanical imitation of life wasn't just possible, it could be beautiful, precise, and utterly mesmerizing. And let's not forget the lineage to modern robotics. The gear-driven birds, water-powered musicians, and tiny knights of the 14th and 15th centuries were the ancestors of your Roomba, your coffee machine, and the occasional overly friendly office robot. Basically, a 600-year-old robot gave us your robot vacuum. So yes, you can thank a mechanical bird for not having to sweep today. Modern engineers benefit from centuries of accumulated knowledge, but it all started with the audacity to make wood and metal move like living creatures. When you marvel at a sleek robot assembling cars or delivering packages, remember that its distant relatives flapped wooden wings and poured wine sometimes onto unsuspecting nobles. Medieval automata also taught humans to think systematically about motion. Builders had to plan sequences carefully, anticipate timing errors, and ensure that multiple motions could occur in harmony. This methodical approach, mechanical choreography if you will, foreshadowed concepts used in everything from clockmaking to assembly line production. It showed that lifelike complexity could arise from simple principles if applied thoughtfully. In a sense, automata were a kind of early computational thinking, a reminder that complex results could emerge from coordinated simple actions. There's also a more philosophical takeaway. Medieval engineers turned magic into math. To the untrained observer, a singing bird or a self-pouring cup might have seemed enchanted, but behind the curtain, it was gears, weights, levers, and fluid dynamics at work. Science, in essence, has always been about this transformation, taking the seemingly impossible and proving it is, in fact, a predictable series of principles. Science, making magic look like math since forever. Automata were living proof that humans could take wonder and systematically recreate it. Finally, medieval automata remind us that creativity and engineering are inseparable. Their creators were artists and inventors, dreamers and tinkerers, all rolled into one. They experimented boldly, failed spectacularly, and sometimes succeeded gloriously. Their machines entertained kings, awed audiences, and inspired generations. But more than anything, they demonstrated that the pursuit of knowledge could be fun, whimsical, and sometimes delightfully absurd. In short, the legacy of medieval automata is clear. From a wooden flapping bird to a modern robot vacuum, the quest to animate the inanimate has been long, fascinating, and occasionally hilarious. These machines didn't just perform tricks, they paved the way for centuries of engineering, robotics, and creative invention, proving that a spark of imagination combined with gears and gravity can change the course of history. After a long story of marveling at the ingenuity, elegance, and sheer spectacle of medieval automata, it's time for a more sobering and decidedly humorous reflection. These machines were brilliant, but they would have been terrible roommates. Yes, the engineers of the Middle Ages could make wooden birds flap, mechanical monks bow, and elephants tell time, but none of it translated to practicality. In short, fun, awe-inspiring, and occasionally terrifying, but not exactly convenient. Let's start with fragility. Medieval automata were delicate constructions of wood, brass, rope, and water. A misplaced gear, a misaligned pulley, or even a minor miscalculation in a water reservoir could spell disaster. Imagine bringing home a mechanical knight to entertain your family and discovering it collapsed mid-lunge, knocking over the teapot and leaving your cat thoroughly traumatized. They can wave hello or spontaneously collapse on your cat. Either way, it's a conversation starter. Unlike today's robust machines, medieval automata demanded constant attention, the kind of care that would exhaust even the most patient hobbyist. Then there was maintenance. Unlike modern devices, these robots didn't come with troubleshooting guides or customer support hotlines. When a mechanical bird refused to sing, a knight refused to joust, or a water-driven musician refused to drum, you were on your own. You had to understand the intricacies of gears, pulleys, levers and cams or risk a total meltdown. The good news, fixing them was an education in engineering. The bad news, it was also a full-time job and occasionally involved minor injuries, burned fingers or mild flooding. A medieval automaton wasn't just a novelty, it was a commitment. Unpredictability added to the charm and the frustration. Automata were designed to mimic life, but life, as anyone knows, can be messy. Gears might slip, weights might drop prematurely, and water might leak into places it absolutely shouldn't. Your mechanical jester could spin endlessly in circles. Your elephant clock might trumpet at random intervals, and your humanoid musician could strike a cymbal into thin air. Unlike modern appliances, which mostly fail quietly or display a cheerful error code, medieval robots failed spectacularly, often in front of an audience or during dinner. It's the kind of unpredictability that made them fascinating at court but terrifying at home. Yet despite their impracticality, these automata were undeniably fun and impressive. They entertained kings, awed crowds, and inspired generations of engineers. They demonstrated that wood and metal could approximate life in ways that were both imaginative and technical. They were showpieces, conversation starters, and sometimes prank machines, all rolled into one. Owning one was like having a guest who could simultaneously dazzle you, amuse you, and threaten your furniture. In other words, the perfect housemate, if you were the kind of person who enjoyed a life full of surprises, minor catastrophes, and constant tinkering. What's even more interesting is the lessons they offer today's engineers and hobbyists. Modern robotics owes a debt to these medieval pioneers. From the study of gears and cams to the careful management of timing and motion, these early machines taught humanity how to turn imagination into mechanism. They remind us that innovation is often messy, iterative, and a little chaotic, but when it works, it's magical. A hobbyist building a mechanical automaton today might still face leaks, snapped wires or wayward motors, echoing the frustrations of a 14th century craftsman. And yet, the joy of creation, the thrill of making a machine move with lifelike precision, remains timeless. Finally, let's consider progress. 600 years ago, humans built mechanical humans for fun, entertainment, and spectacle. Today we do the same, but ours can also vacuum, brew coffee, and occasionally insult you with voice-activated reminders. Technology has advanced, but the core impulse remains the same: to animate the inanimate, to impress our friends, and to challenge ourselves. Medieval engineers may not have had Wi-Fi, LEDs, or lithium-ion batteries, but they had creativity, curiosity, and a healthy disregard for potential disasters, qualities that every engineer, past or present, could admire. In the end, medieval automata were remarkable yet imperfect housemates. They demanded care, attention, and constant vigilance. They might break, leak, or misbehave at any moment, but they also entertained, inspired awe, and demonstrated what humans could achieve with ingenuity, imagination, and a little bit of madness. They remind us that engineering isn't just about utility. It's about wonder. It's about turning gears and water into magic. It's about building a mechanical bird that flaps and sings, even if it occasionally drenches your cat. So if you ever dream of having a tiny robotic companion, just remember, a medieval automaton may not fold your laundry, but it will fascinate, amuse, and occasionally terrify you. And isn't that the true essence of any great housemate? The story of the Antikythera mechanism begins not in a grand laboratory or the hands of a genius inventor, but at the bottom of the Aegean Sea. In 1901, a group of sponge divers exploring the coast near the small Greek island of Antikythera stumbled upon something extraordinary. Amidst the usual coral-encrusted debris of a long-lost shipwreck lay fragments of a bronze object that at first glance seemed almost mundane, corroded, barnacle-covered, and utterly inscrutable. It was just another oddity in a sunken treasure trove, or so they thought. Imagine finding a 2,000-year-old gadget and thinking, yep, this is definitely just an elaborate paperweight. The ship itself was a mystery. Dating from around the 1st century BCE, it likely carried a cargo of luxury goods, art, and this strange mechanical device. The bronze fragments, partially broken and fused with seawater corrosion, revealed intricate gears, teeth, and dials, a level of sophistication that no one in the early 20th century could immediately comprehend. At first, divers and archaeologists assumed they had stumbled upon an ordinary navigational instrument, a decorative piece, or perhaps some bizarre piece of jewelry. A computer? In ancient Greece? Surely that was impossible. Once brought to the surface and cleaned, the object only deepened the mystery. Bronze gears, miniature teeth, and concentric dials peeked through corrosion, as if teasing investigators with a puzzle they had no hope of solving. The object's complexity was staggering, but its purpose remained invisible. Early researchers examined it, puzzled by the sheer number of gears and their arrangements. Mechanical devices certainly existed in the ancient world, but nothing of this intricacy had been documented before. In other words, the Greeks had built a machine that seemed light years ahead of its time, yet all historical texts mentioned nothing even remotely like it. The initial attempts to study the mechanism were frustrating, to say the least. Researchers tried peering inside, cleaning it carefully, and even making crude sketches, but the details were almost impossibly delicate. Every fragment suggested a level of precision that seemed inhuman for a civilization that still wrote by hand on papyrus. Scholars could not yet imagine the concept of an analog computer in 100 BCE. To them, it was a magical contraption, the kind of thing a Roman emperor might keep in a secret room for entertainment, or a Hellenistic mathematician might build just to prove they could. For decades, the Antikythera mechanism resisted understanding. It was a medieval IKEA puzzle before IKEA existed, but infinitely more complex, and with bronze instead of particle board. The good news? You had a treasure that could have belonged in a museum. The bad news? You had the most complicated assembly manual imaginable, written in invisible ink, and lost for 2,000 years. Every attempt to recreate or understand it seemed doomed to partial failure. Early X-rays in the mid-20th century hinted at hidden gears behind hidden gears, but no one could yet piece together what they all did. Even the terminology posed a challenge. Scholars called it a mechanism, a device, a calculator, and at times a mystery box. None of these terms captured its brilliance. The Antikythera mechanism wasn't just a gadget, it was a cosmic instrument designed to model the heavens, but at this stage of its discovery, no one yet knew its purpose. It looked like a box of gears, and for a long time that was all anyone dared say. One could imagine the researchers scratching their heads over coffee in early 20th century Athens, muttering, "I think it tells time, or maybe it summons Poseidon." What makes the discovery particularly fascinating is that it challenged our assumptions about technological progress. For decades, textbooks described the history of computers as a linear story, beginning in the 19th century with Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace. Then came this corroded bronze device from ancient Greece, with gears and dials so sophisticated that it could calculate the cycles of the moon, predict eclipses, and track the calendar. Suddenly, our timeline of human ingenuity looked embarrassingly short. Humans had clearly been engineers, mathematicians, and cosmic planners far earlier than anyone realized. Even now, the discovery story is compelling because it combines adventure, science, and sheer improbability. A sunken ship, a team of daring divers, and a mysterious object that lay hidden for 2 millennia, all converged to challenge our understanding of history. From the moment the fragments surfaced, the Antikythera mechanism demanded attention, study, and an endless string of hypotheses. Scholars debated what it was, how it worked, and why it existed. In short, it transformed a sponge diving expedition into the starting point of one of the greatest archaeological mysteries ever. So the next time you lose your smartphone under a pile of papers or can't figure out how to set up a smart home device, take a moment to reflect. Somewhere off the coast of Antikythera, a 2,000-year-old gadget awaits, more complex than anything you own, patiently reminding us that human curiosity and our ability to tinker with the cosmos is nothing new. It was the beginning of a story that would take decades to unfold. a story where bronze gears could unlock the heavens, and where ancient Greek ingenuity quietly whispered to the modern world, "We were cleverer than you think." Once the Antikythera mechanism emerged from the Aegean's depths, and archaeologists realized they were no longer dealing with a mere shipwreck oddity, the next question naturally arose: what exactly is this thing? To most, the corroded bronze fragments might have resembled a medieval clock, a puzzle box, or a miniature torture device designed by someone with too much free time. But in truth, it was something far more astonishing: an ancient analog computer, the first known of its kind. Yes, 2,000 years ago, the Greeks were building machines to calculate the heavens long before anyone imagined circuits, silicon, or even electricity. At its core, the Antikythera mechanism was designed to track celestial movements with remarkable precision. Using a series of interlocking bronze gears, it could model the positions of the sun, moon, and planets against the backdrop of the zodiac. It also predicted the phases of the moon, the timing of eclipses, and even the schedule of the ancient Olympic Games, which, for the Greeks, were as critical as knowing when the next solar eclipse might terrify the countryside. Basically, it was like running Excel spreadsheets with bronze gears and zero electricity, and probably with significantly more patience required to make corrections. Imagine a bronze device about the size of a shoebox, covered in dials, pointers, and inscriptions, all spinning and turning to reveal cosmic alignments. One dial could show the lunar cycle, with a small indicator tracking the moon's phases. Another dial could predict solar and lunar eclipses years in advance. Yet another might keep tabs on the Olympiad cycle, a clever reminder to train for foot races and chariot events decades before they happened. The mechanism was a calendar, an astronomical calculator, and a sporting reminder, all rolled into one intricate machine. Its construction is equally mind-boggling. The device used dozens of interlocking bronze gears, some cut with astonishing precision, a few tiny enough to fit on a fingertip. These gears meshed to convert the circular motion of one dial into the eccentric elliptical motion needed to model the moon's orbit accurately, a feat not trivial even for engineers today. It was the kind of craftsmanship that would make any modern horologist weep with admiration, and probably mutter, "Why didn't we get into bronze instead of microchips?" The level of sophistication implied that whoever built it understood complex mathematical principles far beyond what many historians previously assumed for that period. The Greeks combined geometry, astronomy, and mechanical ingenuity to encode celestial mechanics into a portable physical device. It was no mere toy, it was an educational tool, a demonstration of technical mastery, and perhaps a status symbol for whoever commissioned or owned it. This wasn't just someone showing off by saying, "Look, I have a metal box that does stuff." This was someone saying, "I control the cosmos in bronze." In practical terms, the Antikythera mechanism worked through a system of rotating gears, hand-cranked or turned with a small knob. Each gear represented a different celestial cycle. By turning one main wheel, a cascade of connected gears moved indicators on multiple dials, showing the alignment of the sun, moon, and planets at any given date. Modern X-ray imaging has revealed hidden layers of gearing and surprisingly precise ratios that allowed these ancient engineers to model not just circular, but slightly irregular orbits. In essence, they had built a mechanical way to predict events that would otherwise require years of careful observation and complex calculations. This combination of artistry, mathematics, and sheer mechanical skill is what makes the mechanism so remarkable. It also makes it entirely relatable to modern humans, because we all like tracking cycles. Today we glance at our smartwatches to see steps, heart rate, and sleep patterns. The ancient Greeks, they wanted to track the cosmos itself. Your smartwatch tracks your steps. This tracked the cosmos. Talk about setting the bar high. One could imagine the owner turning the knob and watching the pointers whirl, thinking, next eclipse, check, next Olympiad, check, world domination still in progress. And let's not forget the inscriptions. The dials were covered with Greek lettering, offering explanations and instructions. They acted as guides for using the machine, translating astronomical theory into practical application. This combination of precision engineering and written instruction suggests that the device was intended not just to impress, but to educate, to provide its user with a way to understand and predict the heavens in real time. It was a tool, a teaching device, and perhaps a conversation starter all at once. In short, the Antikythera mechanism redefines what we thought was possible for the ancient world. It was more than a clock, more than a calendar, more than a display of mechanical wizardry. It was an early attempt to bring the cosmos into human hands, to condense centuries of astronomical observation into a bronze, gear-driven device that anyone could consult if they could figure out how to turn the knobs properly. And while it didn't play Spotify or run apps, it did something arguably more impressive. It turned bronze and gears into a tool for predicting the universe. If the Antikythera mechanism amazes us today, just imagine what it must have meant in the Hellenistic world of 100 BCE, when Greek engineers and astronomers were pushing the boundaries of what humanity thought possible. The mechanism wasn't an accident or a simple curiosity. It was the result of deliberate, painstaking craftsmanship, likely created by minds steeped in astronomy, mathematics, and mechanical ingenuity. Whoever built it was a true cosmic nerd. The kind of person who, instead of playing board games or attending symposiums, spent months measuring lunar cycles and hand-cutting bronze gears smaller than a fingernail. And yes, they probably never got a thank you from the emperor. Historians and scientists have speculated about the mechanism's creators, and while no definitive name survives, clues point toward Greek astronomers inspired by figures like Hipparchus or perhaps even Archimedes. Hipparchus, the famed astronomer of the 2nd century BCE, catalogued stars and developed theories of lunar and solar motion that would have made the mechanism possible. Archimedes, of course, was already celebrated for his mastery of levers, pulleys, and mechanical devices, demonstrating that Greek engineers were capable of astonishingly precise and inventive work. The Antikythera mechanism is essentially a physical manifestation of this brilliant Hellenistic mindset. Part astronomer, part mathematician, part engineer, and entirely obsessed with gears. The craftsmanship alone is mind-boggling. Bronze, unlike modern steel or aluminum, is difficult to work with in miniature, yet the mechanism contains gears with teeth so fine and consistent that they could only have been made by someone with exceptional skill, patience, and probably a steady pair of hands. Some gears were as small as a fingernail, while others were designed to mesh precisely to simulate celestial cycles. Mistake in the tooth spacing, the entire calculation could fail. In other words, the mechanism wasn't just a calculator, it was a precision instrument that demanded absolute perfection in its construction. And it wasn't just about craftsmanship, it was about conceptual brilliance. The creator had to understand the mechanics of lunar and solar cycles, including the irregularities caused by the elliptical orbits of celestial bodies. They had to convert these patterns into physical gear ratios, ensuring that a pointer turning on one dial corresponded accurately to the moon's phase or the timing of an eclipse. This is not something that happens by accident. Someone, probably a very determined Greek nerd, spent considerable time translating complex astronomy into metal and motion. Imagine being that engineer. Yes, I understand the cosmos. No, you cannot borrow my gears for your sundial. The level of sophistication demonstrates that Hellenistic science was far more advanced than many textbooks suggest. For centuries, historians assumed the ancient world lacked the technical know-how to produce anything resembling a computer. The Antikythera mechanism shattered that assumption. It wasn't just a curiosity for the rich, or a novelty for philosophers. It was a device that integrated mathematics, astronomy, and mechanical engineering into a single functional instrument. In other words, the Greeks were essentially doing applied science on steroids. And let's not overlook the intellectual culture that made such a device possible. Hellenistic Greece valued learning, debate, and experimentation. Cities like Alexandria, Pergamon, and Rhodes were intellectual hubs where mathematicians and astronomers could share discoveries, exchange ideas, and refine calculations. In such an environment, someone could envision a machine that would track celestial events and predict future ones, and then have the resources and support to actually build it. It's a testament to a culture that appreciated both knowledge and the means to manifest it physically. It's worth picturing the engineer at work, a tiny bronze gear in hand, tweezers in the other, eyes squinting to measure fractions of a millimeter, and a scribbled astronomical table on the desk. Day after day, gear after gear, aligning dials and calculating ratios, possibly muttering, "If this pointer is off by a millimeter, the moon will misbehave." Greek nerds, inventing analog computers before people even invented analog calculators. And yet, for all this brilliance, it's unlikely the mechanism ever made its creator famous. Most likely it was admired privately, its secrets known only to a select few. Finally, the mechanism also reflects a fusion of art and science. It wasn't just functional, it was elegant. The inscriptions, dials, and pointers were meticulously designed, not just to work but to communicate. Its very existence demonstrates a worldview where understanding the cosmos was both practical and beautiful, where mathematical precision could coexist with aesthetic grace. The Antikythera mechanism wasn't merely a tool, it was a statement about human curiosity and ingenuity, a reminder that even 2,000 years ago, people were capable of engineering marvels that would baffle generations to come. In short, the Antikythera mechanism wasn't just a device, it was a monument to Greek engineering, mathematics, and astronomical genius, painstakingly handcrafted by someone willing to translate the cosmos into gears, dials, and bronze. It is proof that ancient engineers were every bit as ambitious, meticulous, and slightly obsessive as any modern scientist. They just did it without 3D printers, CAD software, or espresso machines to fuel late-night work sessions. The Antikythera mechanism is not just remarkable because it exists, it's remarkable because it actually works, at least in the sense that it could model the heavens with astonishing precision. To fully appreciate this, we need to peek under the hood, or rather behind the bronze casing, to understand how a 2,000-year-old collection of gears, dials, and pointers became what many scholars now recognize as the world's first analog computer. At its core, the mechanism relied on a network of interlocking bronze gears, each meticulously cut and calibrated to transfer motion from one dial to another. Some of these gears were small, barely larger than a fingernail, while others were larger, spanning several centimeters, yet all had teeth crafted to exact specifications. Each tooth was a fraction of a millimeter off, and the entire system depended on perfect alignment. Mistake one measurement, and suddenly your lunar phase is out by days. Your eclipse predictions are meaningless, and your ancient Greek friends might look at you suspiciously, muttering, "Clearly you need more philosophy and less tinkering." One of the most fascinating aspects of the mechanism is the use of differential gears, a concept so advanced that it wouldn't appear in European engineering for more than a millennium. Differential gears allowed the device to account for the moon's irregular orbit. The moon doesn't travel in a perfect circle. Its speed changes slightly depending on its position relative to Earth. The mechanism accounted for this eccentricity mechanically, using a clever system of gears within gears to translate simple circular motion into the more complex elliptical path of the moon. In other words, this bronze box was doing what a modern orbital simulator might do in software, but entirely with metal teeth and hand-cranked motion. The Antikythera mechanism didn't just track the moon, it also modeled solar cycles and eclipses. Through a series of connected dials and pointers, users could see when the sun and moon would align, creating either solar or lunar eclipses. Gears calculated the Metonic cycle, 19 years, the Saros cycle, approximately 18 years and 11 days, and even the Callipic cycle, 76 years, effectively predicting celestial events decades in advance. Imagine trying to plan a surprise picnic while consulting a device that tells you the sun will be swallowed by the moon in precisely 3,476 days. Gears turning, dials spinning, basically a 2,000-year-old version of fiddling with your smartwatch settings, except your smartwatch doesn't cause ancient Greek mathematicians to faint from admiration. Physical construction was equally astounding. Each gear was hand-cut from bronze, with teeth carefully shaped and spaced to ensure accuracy. The dials were engraved with Greek inscriptions describing months, constellations, lunar phases, and Olympiad cycles. Some dials were concentric, meaning one hand or pointer would rotate within another, translating movement from one system to another. The entire device was compact, roughly the size of a shoebox, yet it contained more moving parts than most clocks built 1,000 years later. Mechanically, the device was elegant, yet surprisingly robust. Crank one dial, and all connected gears would move in perfect harmony, updating the positions of celestial bodies across multiple scales. The main front dial displayed the calendar and zodiac positions of the sun and moon, while the back dials revealed eclipses, Olympic cycles, and possibly planetary positions. Some scholars suggest additional pointers might have indicated the positions of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, though evidence is incomplete. Regardless, the mechanism was a fully functioning astronomical computer capable of tracking and predicting the cosmos in real time, all through physical motion rather than ink, papyrus, or numbers. The genius lies in the precision of gear ratios. Bronze gears were cut so that one complete rotation of a small gear could correspond to the moon's synodic month, while larger gears rotated in perfect synchrony to display years, eclipse cycles, and Olympiads. The engineering demonstrates an understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and mechanics that is utterly staggering. Essentially, the Greeks had translated the abstract motion of celestial bodies into tangible, visible movement. A pointer on a dial didn't just represent a date, it represented the position of the moon in the sky, calculated mechanically. Humor aside, this was a triumph of human ingenuity. A device so small could model multiple overlapping astronomical cycles with such accuracy that it still baffles engineers and historians today. For perspective, it is like discovering a time machine built out of gears, showing how meticulous observation and mechanical skill can emulate the universe itself. And yes, it predicted eclipses, cool, unless you were planning a romantic picnic in 85 BCE and hadn't checked the pointer. In short, the Antikythera mechanism demonstrates that the ancient Greeks didn't just theorize about the heavens, they built them into bronze, gear by gear, pointer by pointer. It is both a scientific instrument and a work of art, a device that blends function, precision, and intellectual curiosity in a way that modern engineers still marvel at. By studying how it worked, we see that mechanical ingenuity has deep roots, and that even 2 millennia ago, humans were capable of constructing machines that rival the complexity of some of today's analog devices. The Antikythera mechanism isn't just a quirky artifact sitting in a museum display case. It's a profound reminder that our understanding of history is far from complete, and that the ancient Greeks were far more technologically sophisticated than most textbooks give them credit for. For centuries, historians assumed that advanced mechanical computation was a modern invention, beginning with Charles Babbage in the 19th century. The discovery of the Antikythera mechanism shattered that assumption, revealing a civilization capable of building what amounts to a 2,000-year-old analog computer. In other words, turns out the Greeks didn't just invent democracy, they invented cosmic spreadsheets too. Before its discovery, the prevailing narrative suggested that ancient societies, even brilliant ones like Hellenistic Greece, relied primarily on observation, arithmetic, and geometric calculations, basically mental math with a side of wax tablets. The Antikythera mechanism proved that these civilizations could also engineer extraordinarily complex mechanical solutions to model the cosmos. It demonstrated that Greek engineers were not only observing the sky but translating celestial phenomena into physical devices with multiple interlocking functions. This changed the way historians think about the limits of ancient engineering. People capable of producing bronze statues and philosophical treatises were also crafting machines that rival some early modern clocks in complexity. Its significance extends beyond just, wow, ancient gears exist. The mechanism serves as a bridge between science, craftsmanship, and mathematical theory. It's a physical embodiment of knowledge, astronomy, mathematics, and mechanical engineering working in perfect harmony. Every gear, dial, and pointer reflects careful observation, precise calculation and skilled fabrication. This wasn't a simple clock or a decorative object. It was a learning tool, a predictive instrument, and a demonstration of mastery over the cosmos. Ancient engineers translated abstract celestial patterns into tangible, observable motion. It's like the universe itself had been condensed into a bronze box, spinning and ticking quietly on a ship off Antikythera. In practical terms, the mechanism represents a leap in predictive technology. By modeling lunar and solar cycles, eclipse predictions, and even the timing of the ancient Olympic Games, it allowed its users to plan events decades in advance. Imagine trying to coordinate athletic festivals or religious ceremonies without the ability to forecast the heavens. Then imagine having a machine that tells you precisely when the moon will disappear behind the sun, or when your next festival aligns perfectly with the stars. That's a level of strategic foresight and applied science that seems almost magical for 100 BCE. The mechanism also has profound implications for the history of engineering. For years, scholars believed that gear-driven mechanisms capable of calculating celestial motions were a product of the Renaissance, emerging only in the 14th or 15th centuries. The Antikythera mechanism proves otherwise. Hellenistic engineers had already mastered complex gearing, differential mechanisms, and calibrated dials. Its sophistication is such that modern scientists have noted it would take more than 1,000 years for European technology to catch up. To put it bluntly, basically 2,000 years ago, someone built a computer so smart it could give your laptop an inferiority complex. It also reshapes our understanding of technological diffusion. This was not an isolated curiosity. It hints at a broader culture of experimentation and applied science in the ancient Mediterranean world. The Greeks were not just theorizing in scrolls or lecture halls. They were building devices, testing them, and refining their understanding of mathematics and astronomy through hands-on experience. The Antikythera mechanism shows that practical engineering and theoretical knowledge were deeply intertwined, challenging the notion that the ancient world was purely philosophical or observational. Furthermore, it inspires us to rethink what we mean by progress. Modern civilization often assumes that technology evolves linearly, that the future is always more advanced than the past. The Antikythera mechanism reminds us that brilliant solutions existed long before electricity, computers, or CAD software. People in the Hellenistic period were capable of creating machines that performed calculations we would not expect from a society with no modern tools. It's a lesson in humility. Sometimes human ingenuity leaps forward and then pauses for centuries, leaving future generations scratching their heads. Finally, the Antikythera mechanism resonates on a philosophical level. It illustrates the timeless human desire to understand and predict the universe. Ancient Greeks, like engineers today, sought to model reality, identify patterns, and exert a measure of control over the seemingly chaotic cosmos. In doing so, they created something that is simultaneously functional, educational, and awe-inspiring, a tangible monument to curiosity, intelligence, and craftsmanship. In short, the Antikythera mechanism matters because it rewrites history, challenges assumptions, and bridges astronomy, mathematics, and mechanical ingenuity. It's proof that ancient Greeks were capable of feats so complex that we are still unpacking them 2 millennia later. And as a side note, it's comforting to know that even 2,000 years ago, humans were obsessed with making tools that make sense of the world, so really not much has changed. The Antikythera mechanism may have been lost to the sea for 2,000 years, but its mysteries didn't stay hidden forever. In the 20th and 21st centuries, modern scientists armed with advanced technology began peeling back the layers of corrosion and time to reveal the brilliance of this ancient device. If the original creators were Greek nerds marveling at their own handiwork, modern researchers approached it with equal awe, plus a hint of confusion, staring at corroded bronze fragments and thinking, yep, ancient Steve Jobs. When first discovered, the mechanism's complexity was impossible to decipher. For decades, scholars could only examine the pieces with the naked eye, hoping that careful measurement and educated guesses might reveal some function. Progress was slow. The corrosion had fused parts together, and many gears were hidden beneath layers of mineral deposits. Traditional photography and sketches were insufficient to understand its three-dimensional construction. Enter the magic of X-ray imaging and later 3D tomography. These tools allowed researchers to peer inside without dismantling or damaging the ancient mechanism, revealing hidden gears and intricate arrangements previously invisible to the human eye. It was as if the machine were whispering its secrets through metal and time, finally answering the questions that had puzzled scholars for a century. With modern imaging techniques, scientists discovered gears within gears, small hidden wheels, and complex differential mechanisms that confirmed the device could model lunar and solar cycles with astounding accuracy. Using 3D reconstructions, researchers could rotate virtual dials, align pointers, and watch the mechanism simulate the cosmos. What was once a corroded mystery had become a fully functional digital model, showing exactly how the ancient Greeks calculated eclipses, tracked lunar phases, and predicted the timing of Olympic Games. To a modern observer, it was like discovering a 2,000-year-old iPhone, only with bronze, gears, and zero Wi-Fi. Replicas played a key role as well. Once scientists understood the basic design through imaging, they built working physical copies using bronze and brass. Turning the crank on a replica revealed the gears in motion, the dials spinning, and the pointers following the moon and sun. These replicas weren't just educational, they proved hypotheses about how the mechanism functioned. Sometimes watching these dials move prompted researchers to rethink previous assumptions about ancient Greek knowledge, their understanding of orbital mechanics, and the precision of their handcrafting. It's one thing to look at a corroded chunk of metal. It's another to hold a fully functional bronze computer and realize, yes, these ancient engineers really did know what they were doing. Digital models, meanwhile, allowed for interactive exploration. Scholars could simulate different configurations, test gear ratios, and even visualize how missing components might have functioned. This kind of virtual reconstruction provides a new lens for understanding ancient innovation. It's one thing to read an academic paper about lunar cycles or differential gears. It's another to manipulate a virtual mechanism that does exactly what the Greeks designed it to do. Modern engineers, astronomers, and historians now collaborate, combining mechanical analysis, computer modeling, and historical research to unlock the secrets of the Antikythera mechanism. Studying the mechanism today also reveals lessons about engineering problem-solving that remain relevant, and its creators had to deal with challenges that modern engineers still face: precision fabrication, synchronizing multiple moving parts, and translating abstract calculations into practical physical mechanisms. In other words, the ancient Greeks were doing applied mechanical engineering without CAD software, computers, or power tools. Their successes remind us that ingenuity and patience can overcome technological limitations, even when constrained by material and knowledge. Humor aside, the modern study of the mechanism underscores the power of interdisciplinary collaboration. Historians, archaeologists, physicists, engineers, and mathematicians all contribute pieces of the puzzle. Each X-ray scan, 3D model, and replica adds insight, illustrating how knowledge can cross centuries. The project has transformed a corroded mystery from a dusty museum artifact into a living lesson in curiosity, craftsmanship, and intellectual perseverance. In a broader sense, modern science interacting with ancient technology is humbling. Imagine staring at a bronze block from a shipwreck and realizing you are witnessing the world's first known analog computer, meticulously calculating the cosmos long before steam engines, electricity, or silicon chips. There's a thrill in discovering that the past contains surprises that rival or even surpass modern assumptions about progress. The Antikythera mechanism reminds us that innovation is not linear and that ingenuity often leaps ahead, only to be lost or forgotten for centuries. So when researchers today turn cranks, examine X-ray scans, or manipulate 3D models of this ancient device, they aren't just studying a relic, they're time-traveling into the minds of engineers who mastered the heavens in bronze. And while they might joke about decoding a 2,000-year-old phone without Wi-Fi, the truth is that every scan, Every replica and every model brings humanity closer to understanding how our ancestors combined observation, mathematics, and mechanics to build something that continues to astound the modern world. After delving into gears, pointers, dials, and bronze magic, it's time to step back and reflect on what the Antikythera mechanism truly represents. Beyond being an ancient curiosity, beyond being a device that predicted eclipses and Olympic Games, it stands as a monument to human ingenuity, a testament to what our ancestors could achieve with observation, mathematics, and sheer determination. In a world where we often assume that technological brilliance is modern, the mechanism reminds us that brilliance is timeless. First, consider the scale of achievement. A civilization without electricity, computers, or precision power tools managed to construct a machine capable of tracking celestial cycles with near-perfect accuracy. That's not luck, that's careful calculation, rigorous observation, and meticulous craftsmanship. Every gear, every dial, every pointer reflects centuries of accumulated knowledge, astronomy, mathematics, engineering, all encoded into metal and motion, and yet, despite its sophistication, the mechanism was built for practical and educational purposes, not just to impress. It demonstrates that human curiosity has always pushed us to understand and predict the universe, even if that means turning bronze wheels instead of tapping a touchscreen. Humorously, if the Antikythera mechanism could talk, it might sigh at our current reliance on smartphones, tablets, and smartwatches. It might shake its bronze head and mutter, "You call that technology? I tracked the cosmos while you're struggling to find Wi-Fi." It would probably chuckle at the irony. 2,000 years ago, someone painstakingly built a device to measure the heavens, and today we carry machines in our pockets that can do it instantly. But we mostly use them to watch cat videos. Yet the mechanism's creators were no less human. They too were obsessed with tracking time, predicting cycles, and making life slightly more complicated than it needed to be. Some things never change. One of the most important lessons from the mechanism is that technological progress is not linear. We like to imagine that history is a steady march forward. Yesterday's people struggled with candles, today we have artificial intelligence. But discoveries like the Antikythera mechanism reveal that technological leaps happened long before we assumed. Engineers of Hellenistic Greece achieved mechanical sophistication that would not reappear in Europe for over a millennium. The mechanism shows that innovation can emerge, vanish, and re-emerge across centuries, sometimes waiting for the right context, tools, or curiosity to revive it. It also encourages us to rethink the capabilities of ancient civilizations. Too often, history textbooks oversimplify the past, reducing it to generalized statements. Greeks built temples, Romans built roads, medieval Europe had plagues. But the mechanism reminds us that these societies were capable of extraordinary technical feats. Engineers and scientists were thinking deeply about mathematics, astronomy, and mechanics, and translating that knowledge into tangible, functional devices. The Antikythera mechanism is evidence that the human drive to understand and manipulate the world has always existed, and that ingenuity transcends time, culture, and available technology. Another lesson lies in the blend of art and science. The mechanism wasn't purely functional. It was elegantly designed, carefully engraved, and visually communicative. Ancient engineers considered not just utility but clarity, durability, and aesthetics. Modern designers and engineers can take a page from this playbook. Successful inventions often combine precision, functionality, and thoughtful presentation. In other words, the Greeks didn't just track lunar phases, they did it beautifully, like engineers who moonlight as artists. Finally, the mechanism inspires curiosity and wonder. Studying it today through X-rays, 3D reconstructions, and replicas connects us to people across 2 millennia who were equally fascinated by the sky, the passage of time, and the challenges of making abstract concepts tangible. It reminds us that learning and experimentation are timeless human activities, and it encourages us to look around with a sharper eye, to wonder what other marvels lie buried, forgotten, or misunderstood, waiting for curious minds to uncover them. So, what do we take away from this 2,000-year-old marvel? First, humans have always been obsessed with time. the heavens, and complicated devices. Second, technological genius is not a modern invention. It can emerge in surprising places and then vanish, only to be rediscovered centuries later. And third, curiosity, creativity, and persistence are universal. They are the forces that allowed a Greek engineer to craft a bronze computer long before silicon chips or screens, and they are the same forces that allow us to build and innovate today. In short, the Antikythera mechanism is more than a collection of bronze gears. It's a message across millennia. Humans are endlessly inventive, deeply curious, and occasionally a little obsessed with making things unnecessarily complicated. And that's a comforting thought. Even if our ancestors had no Wi-Fi, no electricity, and no microchips, they still managed to create something extraordinary. Something that, if it could talk, might just roll its gears in amusement at our obsession with digital life and then silently remind us, "You're welcome."